On July 29, 2016, Gabriella and her younger sister, Sunilda, started their day as usual. That evening, they planned to visit a nearby internet cafe to work on some school assignments. Because they didn't have internet at home, these trips to the local cafe had become a regular part of their lives. Going to the cafe was how they accessed the internet to stay connected and complete their assignments. Around 6 p.m., Gabriella and Sunilda left the house as usual, without causing any concern. But after walking a few blocks, Gabriella abruptly changed her mind. She told Sunilda that she wouldn't be accompanying her and that she was going to see her boyfriend instead. Sunilda was a little surprised but didn't ask any questions. Gabriella had gone off alone before. Gabriella assured her she would return soon, then walked away in the opposite direction. That was the last time the two sisters saw each other. Sunilda went to the cafe by herself. That evening, when she got home, she realized that Gabriella still wasn't back yet. Al principio, nadie le dio mucha importancia. Es como que los adolescentes se queden fuera hasta tarde, especialmente en verano. Sin embargo, a medida que anochecia, la preocupación empezó a aumentar. Liliana, their mother, tried to call Gabriella but got no answer. She sent messages on WhatsApp, which at first were not read. Later, the messages appeared as read, but Gabriella never replied. It was clear someone was seeing the messages, but not responding. Panic set in when a young man, whom the family believed to be Gabriella's boyfriend, showed up at their door. He asked a question that stunned everyone, because they had all assumed that Gabriella was with him. His confusion seemed real. He truly didn't know where she was. That moment changed everything. Until then, everyone had just thought Gabriella was out later than usual. If her boyfriend hadn't seen her that night, it's possible she never made it to meet him. That's when her family realized something was wrong. Sunilda remembered watching Gabriella turn a corner in the direction of a boarding house where one of their relatives had once lived. At the time, it hadn't seemed significant. The next morning, it was obvious that Gabriella was missing. Her phone was still active, but she didn't answer any calls. The mood at home grew tense. Her loved ones started reaching out to everyone they knew, relatives, friends, even her father, but nobody knew where she was. It seemed as though she had vanished without a trace. The family decided to take official action. Liliana contacted the local authorities, who then opened the missing person case. Soon after, flyers about the case were posted around the neighborhood. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers helped with the search. However, after Gabriella turned the corner and left her sister behind, no one saw her again. Gabriella Verol was born in Argentina in 1998 to Bolivian parents. Her parents separated when she was 6 years old. After her parents separated, Gabriella lived with her mother, Liliana Cham, and later started calling another man, Cesar Garcia, her father. He became her stepfather. Sunilda and other relatives from Liliana's family also lived in the same house. Life at home was difficult. The family made great efforts to create a stable home and meet their basic needs, but the atmosphere was often tense and arguments happened frequently. Gabriella frequently had stressful encounters with her grandmother, and their arguments were much more heated than typical family disputes. The adults were emotionally distant and didn't understand her, which constantly made her feel under pressure. During her teenage years, Gabriella faced the typical challenges of growing up. However, living in a home without personal space or privacy made these difficulties even harder for her. She didn't have a good place to rest or study. She dreamed of living with her biological father, who lived apart from her with another family. Pero ese deseo nunca se cumplió. Al no mantuvo una comunicación constante y también estaba enfrentando sus propios problemas personales. Eventually, the situation at home became too difficult for Gabriella to handle. She decided to leave, taking her younger sister Sunilda with her. For a time, they stayed at the house of their Aunt Marisol, their father's sister. The two sisters hadn't planned to leave permanently or thought it through carefully, but their leaving was a sign that something was wrong. They stayed at their aunt's house for about a week. Life there was more peaceful and there was less strict adult supervision, but this brief period didn't result in any lasting changes. When Gabriella returned to her mother's house, she once again found herself surrounded by the same pressure and stress she had tried to get away from. Although Gabriella was quiet, she was clearly independent. She wore simple clothes, avoided drawing attention to herself, and stayed away from noisy or boisterous groups. However, she was still ambitious. She often envisioned a future in which she could shape her own life. Unfortunately, her limited resources made it difficult to pursue those dreams. She didn't have a computer or reliable internet access at home. Even basic things like homework required her to walk to the nearest internet cafe. As mentioned before, this demanded extra planning and often led to more stress at home. In addition to these daily difficulties, Gabriella also felt a strong sense of emotional distance. Her opinions were often ignored, and her needs were rarely prioritized. Even within her own family, she felt more like an outsider than a real member. She never openly argued with her mother, Liliana. However, Liliana was always so overwhelmed by her responsibilities that she often didn't notice what her daughter was experiencing. Gabriella's stepfather fulfilled his duties, but they never developed a close relationship. There was always a distance between them. Over the years, all of this made Gabriella feel increasingly isolated. She didn't feel safe at home, and she couldn't see any realistic way to find support or make a change outside of it. Life felt like a cycle she couldn't escape, where any progress depended entirely on her own efforts. At home, there was a shortage of resources, emotional support, and space for her to grow. Her desire for independence was no longer just a normal part of growing up, it became a true necessity. This mindset began to guide her choices and actions over time. Against this emotionally vulnerable but outwardly calm backdrop, a series of events began to unfold. These events would eventually lead to devastating consequences. Esther Quintana, born in 1986, was married to Elizabeth Cham, who is Gabriella's maternal aunt. This marriage made Esther a member of Gabriella's family, and they frequently saw each other, as they lived in the same household. For a long time, no one in the family had any concerns about his behavior. They saw him as calm, reliable, and responsible, with a respectable job at the Argentine Prefecture, a federal security agency. He didn't raise any red flags. He stayed out of arguments, helped with household chores, and was present at family gatherings. He was a quiet part of everyday life. He lived with his wife and her family, ate meals with them, took part in family gatherings, and helped with daily chores. To those around him, he seemed like a reliable and discreet adult who handled family matters appropriately and never overstepped his boundaries. Over time, small, isolated incidents began to occur, minor things that didn't seem concerning at first, such as a strange remark or an odd situation. There was no single event, but these details gradually changed how people saw him. After he and Elizabeth separated, Esther left the family home. He moved into a low-cost boarding house near the area where his family still lived. At the time, his relatives thought this was simply the usual thing to do after a marriage ended. This move marked a turning point. It began a new phase in which his behavior slowly changed from neutral to unsettling, even though no one could clearly describe why they felt uneasy. Even though Esther no longer lived with the family, he still kept in touch with them, especially with Gabriella. As time passed, people started noticing that he was spending more and more time alone with her. These meetings took place outside the home, in neutral locations. Neighbors who witnessed these interactions were unsure how to interpret them. One man remembered seeing Gabriella and Esther together on a bus. Gabriella was sitting on Esther's lap while he softly stroked her hair. The man felt uncomfortable watching this but chose not to mention it to the family. He later admitted that he hesitated because he was afraid of causing a scene or damaging family relationships. He decided not to say anything. Other people in the neighborhood reported seeing similar things. Several residents had seen Gabriella near the boarding house where Esther lived. At times, she would go into the building, remain there for an hour or two, and then leave quietly. No one expressed any concern when this happened. Because Esther had once been married to Gabriella's aunt, No one thought their interactions were unusual at first. Their family relationship led people to trust them and not question their meetings. Gabriella never told anyone she visited him, and there was no obvious reason to suspect anything improper was happening. They also had no formal relationship. Nestor was not her guardian and had no legal right to be involved in her life. However, he was still somewhat connected to the family, so his actions were considered personal decisions and were not subject to supervision. Gabriella's family didn't keep track of where she was, believing she was either with friends or running errands. It was later revealed that many of their meetings took place at the boarding house where Nestor had rented a small room. He often invited Gabriella there, and they kept their visits private. She would arrive by herself and leave without drawing attention. Over time, their relationship changed in ways that went beyond simple familial affection. At the time, however, none of the adults realized how deep their connection had become. Even after his marriage to Elizabeth ended, Gabriella continued to seek contact with him. She never talked about what happened during those visits or shared any details with anyone. Only after she disappeared did people begin to understand the whole story, the clues they had previously missed. At first, there was no clear indication that Gabriella had any reason to keep secrets. She seemed calm and friendly around her relatives, but it later became clear that her relationship with Nestor was something she could not discuss openly. Reportedly, their connection began when Gabriella was just 13. At that point, Nestor was already a grown man, employed in a federal security role and married to her maternal aunt, which made the situation even more troubling. He was not just a stranger, he was a trusted adult in her home, connected to her family, and seen as safe by everyone around her. The first details of this story began to emerge when the investigation started. Friends who had never shown much interest in Gabriella's personal life began to comment. Several people admitted that they had suspected for years that something was wrong between her and Nestor. Some recalled seeing him repeatedly near Gabriella's school, offering her rides or finding reasons to be there. At first, his actions appeared to be motivated by concern, but over time they became more obsessive. The way he behaved was not what you would normally expect from a family member. He monitored her social life, tracked whom she spoke to, and showed signs of jealousy. Gabriella tried to maintain normal friendships, but Nestor's influence made her feel increasingly restricted. People close to her said that he constantly tried to contact her, often calling her repeatedly if she didn't answer immediately. Those who witnessed how urgently he needed to know her whereabouts at all times recognized this as a warning sign. In later messages used as evidence, he accused her of being distant, demanded explanations for her actions, and insisted that she account for how she spent her time when she wasn't with him. These were not isolated incidents, they formed a consistent pattern of controlling and obsessive behavior. Classmates remembered times when Gabriella would only attend events if he gave her permission. Initially, it appeared as if she was simply dealing with strict family rules or a difficult home situation. No one realized that the true reason was the pressure from an adult man who maintained a controlling environment around her. A close friend later recalled that Gabriella had once confided in her, saying she hadn't felt free in a long time and asking her to keep it a secret. At the time, it seemed like something typical a teenager might say. Later, those words would take on much deeper significance. Through the voice messages Nestor sent Gabriella, investigators made a disturbing discovery. He saw her as someone he possessed. In the recordings, his tone shifted between pleading and demanding. He accused her of cheating, doubted her honesty, and repeatedly insisted that she prove her loyalty. When Gabriella began spending time with someone her own age, Nestor started to act increasingly hostile. He made it clear that he could not tolerate her being close to anyone else, not even her friends. The investigation found that this caused tensions between them to escalate even further during that period. As Gabriella grew more distant, Nestor intensified his efforts to regain control. Meanwhile, her friends noticed that Gabriella's emotional well-being was deteriorating. She became increasingly anxious and withdrawn, and she stopped talking about her future. When she tried to leave Nestor, he responded by ramping up his manipulation. He pressured her psychologically, used emotional blackmail, made threats, and tried to make her feel guilty. Relatives living nearby had no idea this was happening. As investigators examined his actions more closely, a clear pattern emerged. He not only violated personal boundaries, but also purposely created a relationship of dependence by taking advantage of his age, his authority, and the trust the family placed in him. Gabriella's friends later confessed that, while they sensed something was wrong, they did not realize the seriousness of the situation. She remained silent out of fear, shame, and the conviction that no one would believe her if she told the truth. This silence allowed Nestor to maintain control over her for years. Gabriella grew up in a home without adequate support, which left her vulnerable. A man, initially only a relative, entered her life and gradually became a dominant presence from whom she could not escape. This situation paved the way for the tragedy that followed. After Gabriella went missing, the police launched an initial investigation. They questioned her sister, her mother, the young man she was dating, and several other acquaintances. Officers began searching the neighborhood and spoke with residents living within a few blocks of where Gabriella was last seen with her sister. Several witnesses reported seeing her later that evening walking down the street with a man. One witness specifically remembered seeing them heading toward the boarding house. Investigators believe that, given the time and place, Gabriella may have intentionally gone there. Meanwhile, some of Gabriella's friends, previously too afraid to speak up, began providing information. As more evidence was gathered, it became clear that Gabriella's disappearance was not accidental. There were no signs that she had run away or made a sudden decision to leave. She left without taking any belongings or informing anyone of her plans. After Nestor Quintana was identified as a person of interest, authorities brought him in for questioning. Initially, he appeared confident. He claimed he had not been in contact with the family for a long time, that he no longer knew anything about Gabriella's life, and that he had nothing to do with her disappearance. He explained that he stayed out of family matters because he and Elizabeth were divorced. At first, his answers seemed consistent. However, investigators soon found several contradictions. Neighbors and other residents reported seeing Nestor still meeting with Gabriella. Witnesses often saw them together near the boarding house, and her friends stated he behaved in a controlling manner, evidence that directly contradicted his previous statements. The investigators intensified their questioning. Nestor was summoned for additional interviews, and with each session, he grew less confident. He began muddling the timeline, changing his story, and avoiding direct questions. Even those who had initially believed he was not involved began to have doubts. The situation shifted noticeably a few days after the investigation gained momentum. Nestor arrived at the police station without prior notice and asked to speak with an officer. This time, he admitted to having had contact with Gabriella and claimed to know where she was. Then he made a confession that changed the whole investigation. He stated that, as on previous occasions, he met with Gabriella on the evening of July 29th. According to him, they had an argument that night. Nestor said the argument escalated and, during the struggle, he lost control and accidentally killed Gabriella by strangling her. He revealed the precise location of her body, explaining that he had hidden it in his room at the boarding house, wrapped in bed sheets and plastic. He claimed that he had acted impulsively during an emotional breakdown and had not planned the act in advance. Police quickly proceeded to the location he mentioned. There, in the room he had rented, investigators discovered Gabriella's body. It was carefully wrapped in several layers of fabric and plastic bags and placed in the corner of the room. Forensic specialists arrived at the scene, determining that the body had been in the room for several days. However, because the room was sealed, decomposition had been limited. Investigators collected all nearby items for forensic examination. An initial autopsy determined that the cause of death was manual strangulation. No signs of sexual assault were found, so investigators ruled out such a motive. However, the main question remained unanswered. If the motive was not sexual assault, what provoked such a violent reaction? Some believe the act resulted from long-term emotional stress, jealousy, and an adult's inability to accept Gabriella's growing independence. Only further interviews and psychological assessments could confirm whether this theory was correct. The authorities informed Gabriella's family of Nestor's confession. The shock was immense. Her mother, stepfather, and other relatives could not believe that someone they had lived with was capable of such an act. Nestor, once regarded as a caring uncle, had now admitted to causing her death. For many people, the news was more than just devastating, it completely destroyed their trust in those closest to them. Cesar Garcia, Gabriela's stepfather, told reporters that he was struggling to understand what had happened. He said that Nestor had never acted suspiciously and was always seen as a trustworthy, ordinary family member. Gabriela's sister, Sunsilda, did not make any public statements and remained in shock. Their mother was so overwhelmed by emotion that she burst into tears. The family's grief was made even worse by a profound sense of betrayal. Although Nestor confessed, the investigation continued. Law enforcement needed to confirm whether his statements were true and to ensure he was not withholding any other information. His claim that his actions were caused by an emotional outburst was questionable, especially since he had carefully concealed the body. Investigators also looked into whether Nestor was trying to minimize his role in order to receive a reduced sentence. This issue became part of the case as it proceeded to trial. After Gabriela's body was found and a confession was made, Nestor Quintana's case entered the formal criminal investigation stage, and he was officially charged. However, during the very first court hearing, the situation changed unexpectedly when Nestor suddenly retracted his confession. He stated that the police had pressured him, used psychological coercion, and had not properly informed him of his rights. This new statement formed the basis of his defense strategy. Nestor's lawyer promptly took action to dispute all evidence that had been gathered from the confession. He claimed that the boarding house was searched illegally because there was no valid warrant. The defense also requested the exclusion of text messages, voice recordings, and witness testimonies that were collected before a lawyer was present. They argued that Nestor was mentally unstable at the time and could not understand the consequences of his words. Prosecutors remained resolute. The lead attorney stressed that Nestor's confession was both voluntary and detailed. He also pointed out that Nestor provided exact directions to where Gabriela's body was found, arguing that such specific information could not have been a coincidence. Furthermore, evidence was collected that revealed a long-term pattern of control by the accused over Gabriela, including indications of psychological manipulation and jealousy. A key piece of evidence was finding Nestor's DNA under Gabriela's fingernails, which clearly showed there had been a physical struggle. Several witnesses testified in court. Gabriela's friends spoke about the emotional distress she experienced in the months before she disappeared, describing how Nestor tried to control her, limited her social interactions, and put her under significant emotional pressure. During the proceedings, a message was read aloud in which Nestor made threats. The content had a significant impact on the jury, prompting the defense to adjust its strategy. They described Nestor as someone who was emotionally unstable and acted impulsively due to extreme stress. They stated that his relationship with Gabriela was mutual but unofficial, and that what happened was not premeditated. These claims angered Gabriela's family. Her stepfather, in particular, spoke out after several hearings, saying that attempts to defend the accused were disrespectful to Gabriela's memory. During the trial, Gabriela's mother, Liliana, remained composed and attended every session. The family was clear and united in saying that this was not a domestic dispute. It was a betrayal that ended a life already controlled and suppressed. Their lawyers argued that this was not only a breach of trust, but Nestor's position as a family member made it even worse. The prosecution requested the harshest penalty, life in prison, because of the seriousness of the crime. They pointed to the close family relationship between those involved, the long-term psychological manipulation, and the deliberate effort to conceal the body. Once both sides gave their closing arguments, the jury was sent out to deliberate and make their decision. Tension filled the courtroom. Gabriela's family sat quietly, anxiously awaiting the verdict. When the jury returned, the foreperson announced the decision, guilty of first-degree murder, with aggravating factors due to the family relationship and gender-based violence. The judge delivered the sentence without delay. Nestor Quintana was sentenced to life imprisonment. The court dismissed the defense's argument that the confession was coerced, noting that it contained detailed information and was supported by physical evidence. The fact that there had also been long-term psychological control made the charges even more serious. Nuster remained expressionless as the verdict was announced. His lawyers sat in silence, staring at the floor. Across the courtroom, Gabriella's mother began to cry, and her husband held her in his arms. This was not a victory, but a painful farewell. Justice had been served, yet their daughter was lost forever. Tiffany James was born on August 18, 1980, in Tampa, Florida. She was the only child of Rosalind James and Turner Humphrey. Her parents were never married and separated soon after her birth. Her father moved away, started a new family, and showed little interest in her. Years later, as an adult, Tiffany decided to locate her father. They spoke, and she assured him that she held no grudges and wanted to keep in touch. This reunion allowed Tiffany to meet her half-siblings and their families, leading to the development of strong, positive relationships. Meanwhile, Rosalind focused on her own life and left Tiffany with her grandparents. Although Tiffany had both biological parents, she was primarily raised by her grandparents. Her mother Rosalind visited occasionally but did not play an active role in her upbringing. It was her aunts, Barbara and Vicky, along with her grandmother Beulah, who took on the parenting responsibilities. They ensured Tiffany attended preschool and school, celebrated her achievements, and supported her in every way. She was an outstanding student with a passion for literature and a creative spirit. She dreamed of opening her own beauty salon and becoming the best in her city. Tiffany was a sociable, popular, and stylish person. She often attracted attention with her looks and confidence, making her appealing to young men. While in high school, she started dating a boy named Derek Andrews, who was a year older. They both believed their love would last forever. In her senior year, Tiffany became pregnant and gave birth to their first child, a son named Derek, on July 26, 1998. This changed her plans for college, as she dedicated herself to motherhood. Derek took on various odd jobs to support his family, while Tiffany's family helped them as much as they could. In August 2002, 4-year-old Derek became a big brother when his parents welcomed another son, Darian, named after his paternal grandfather. At this point, Tiffany and Derek were living together in a small rented apartment. Although money was tight, they remained hopeful for their future and dreamed of creating a stable life together. A couple of years later, however, their romantic feelings faded, and they decided to separate amicably. The son stayed with Tiffany while Derek supported them and made an effort to spend time with his children. He eventually began a new relationship but remained committed to being an involved father to Darian and Derek. As a single mother with 2 young sons, Tiffany started to seriously consider her future. She wanted a career that would allow her to provide for her family independently. Since she had not pursued further education after high school, she was eager to change that. Tiffany enrolled in a medical college, aiming to become a cosmetic specialist. Her ultimate goal was to open her own practice or even a clinic where she could turn her passion into a successful business. To manage her finances better, she moved back in with her grandparents, as paying for both tuition and rent was too much of a burden. Her family helped care for her sons whenever she was at work or in class. After finishing her education, she got a job at a private clinic as an assistant to a well-known doctor. She had a steady income and began advancing in her career. For a while, it appeared that everything was finally coming together for her. However, she found herself lacking a strong, supportive partner to lean on during difficult times. In early 2007, Tiffany met a man named Daryl Williams. He was 14 years older than she was and had 3 grown children from a previous marriage. Despite their age difference, this did not hinder their romantic relationship. She believed that he was a mature and trustworthy man, genuinely prepared for a serious commitment. Their relationship developed quickly, and soon, Tiffany, at 27, found herself pregnant. This news shocked both of them, but they were excited, and Daryl proposed to Tiffany, who happily accepted. However, during the routine checkup, she learned she was expecting twins. In March 2008, she welcomed twin girls, whom she named Diamond and Denial. This happy event has brought joy to her life, and she has devoted all her love to her family, cherishing every moment spent together. Tiffany enjoyed taking her children to different events, discovering new activities, and creating lasting memories. She also loved dressing her daughters in matching outfits that gave them a fashionable appearance. Her older sons participated in sports like baseball, track, and swimming, while her twins, Diamond and Denia, began dance classes and rhythmic gymnastics at an early age. As the years went by, the children grew, but Tiffany and Daryl never married. Gradually, their relationship began to deteriorate as they found it increasingly difficult to communicate. Tiffany eventually realized that Daryl was not the person she had thought he was. Their relationship ended when she discovered his infidelity. Without any hesitation, she gathered her children and departed. After separating from Daryl, Tiffany relocated with her family to the quiet town of Brandon, Florida. This community was known for its strong infrastructure, low crime rates, and affordable housing, making it an ideal place to raise a family and start over. Eager to create a stable future, Tiffany completed a hairstyling program and landed a job at one of the top salons in town. She quickly built a loyal clientele and gained a reputation for her talent and creativity. Aspiring to open her own salon one day, she began looking for potential rental locations. Her skills, ambition, and rising reputation established her as one of the most in-demand stylists in the area, paving the way for a bright career ahead. As a single mother of 4, she moved into a spacious rental apartment in a newly built residential complex situated in one of the town's finest neighborhoods. Nearby amenities included a school, a dance studio, and a large sports center, everything she needed for a comfortable and fulfilling life for her family. By 2012, her sons had become more independent and often helped care for their younger sisters. Around this time, Tiffany decided to reconnect with her father and half-siblings. She traveled to Alabama to find them, and their family bonds were restored. They began to stay in touch, visit each other for holidays, and their children quickly grew close. Life was falling into place. Her finances were stable, and she was surrounded by loved ones. Although she felt secure about her future, Tiffany, a young, ambitious, and attractive woman, yearned for romance. She still believed in love and hoped to find a man who would love her and embrace her family, a man with whom she could build a strong and happy home. In 2014, Tiffany started her own small business, which began to thrive. That same year, at 34 years old, she reconnected with Ben, a man she had known in her youth but hadn't seen in nearly 15 years. Their unexpected encounter at a shopping mall marked the start of something special. Initially, they kept their relationship private. Ben was also a single parent who had recently settled in Brandon with his 2 young children. They began as friends, sharing coffee and meaningful conversations. When Ben finally confessed his feelings for Tiffany, she felt like the happiest woman in the world and admitted she felt the same way. Their relationship grew deeper and both families supported it. Tiffany was ecstatic, savoring this newfound happiness without rushing. She kept their romance discreet, sharing details only with her closest friends and family and refraining from posting pictures of them together on social media. Gradually, she prepared for a significant change as they decided to move in together and create a home as one family. On October 1, 2015, Tiffany posted a romantic and mysterious message on her personal social media account. The post featured a photo of 2 hands clasped together, one male and one female, both adorned with wedding bands, set against the backdrop of a Bible. The caption simply read, "Yes." This suggested that she was engaged, but she chose to keep her fiancé's identity a secret for the time being. Tiffany and her family always put a lot of effort into celebrating Halloween. They planned their costumes ahead of time, carved pumpkins into glowing lanterns, and went out to collect candy from their neighbors. By this time, Darian and Derek were old enough to enjoy the holiday with their friends, while the younger twins, Diamond and Denia, still loved going trick-or-treating with their mom. Since they lived in a large apartment complex, going door to door wasn't this thrilling. Instead, they visited a nearby neighborhood filled with single-family homes, where Halloween decorations created a festive atmosphere. Families in costumes moved from house to house, and generous homeowners made sure to have plenty of candy, so no one went home empty-handed. That night was supposed to be fun and relaxing, but no one could have predicted the tragedy that was about to unfold. A local woman was home alone, preparing to watch a horror movie to get into the Halloween spirit. The streets outside were quiet, most families had already gone home, and she didn't expect any more trick-or-treaters. Around 9 p.m., she was dozing on the couch with the TV still on when suddenly there was a loud noise, like an explosion, that woke her up. At that moment, her front door, which she had forgotten to lock, swung open. Startled, she quickly got up to shut it. What she saw on her doorstep left her frozen. A figure dressed entirely in black, wearing a hockey mask like the ones from the Friday the 13th movies, stood there. Instead of a machete, the person was holding a shotgun. For a split second, it felt like a scene from a movie or an elaborate Halloween joke. In shock and unsure of her next move, she glanced down and saw a woman lying at the figure's feet, writhing in pain and struggling to move. The masked figure looked down at her for a moment before raising the weapon again. Terrified, the woman ran for her life. She slammed the door just as two more deafening gunshots rang out. Collapsing onto the floor, she covered her head with her hands, fearing she might be next. Then, silence. The stillness was broken by a faint tapping on the window. At first, she ignored it, too frightened to move. But when the tapping came again, she cautiously approached the window and, against her better judgment, looked outside. There stood a young girl, tears streaming down her face. Without thinking of her own safety, the woman rushed to the door to help. Outside, she noticed another young girl sitting on the ground, shocked, hugging her knees. Without hesitation, she brought both girls inside, locked the door, and grabbed her phone to call for emergency services. By that time, other neighbors had heard the chaos and called the authorities. When first responders arrived, they discovered a woman lying in a pool of blood on the pavement. Despite her critical injuries, she was still alive. Paramedics did everything they could, but unfortunately, on the way to the hospital, she died from her wounds. The victim had no identification, and the two young girls were too traumatized to speak. However, as more neighbors gathered, they quickly recognized the woman, Tiffany, who is the owner of a local hair salon, along with her twin daughters, Diamond and Denaya. Authorities immediately contacted Tiffany's relatives, while Diamond and Denaya were taken to the hospital for evaluation. Fortunately, neither child had suffered any physical injuries, but they were deeply traumatized. Mental health professionals were brought in to help them process the event. Many people had been out celebrating that night, and several witnesses recalled the horrifying scene. However, piecing together the full story was challenging, as many struggled to believe what they had seen. It all felt too surreal, almost like a staged performance. Meanwhile, the masked attacker slipped into the crowd of costumed revelers and disappeared without a trace. Neighbors reported seeing a silver Chevrolet sedan parked near the house shortly before the incident. Witnesses noted that the car sped off after the first loud noise but stopped a short distance away moments later. It was uncertain whether the driver fled in a panic or had a connection to the attack. Unfortunately, no one saw the license plate, and no one could identify the driver's gender. Adding to the difficulty, there were no security cameras in the area to capture the incident. Witnesses could not provide even a basic description of the suspect, who was fully covered in a costume, hood, hockey mask, and gloves. They only agreed that the attacker was slightly taller than average and had a muscular build. At the crime scene, Tiffany's handbag was found on the ground, with its strap torn and its contents strewn about. Initially, investigators considered the possibility of a robbery gone wrong, but this theory was quickly dismissed. The cash inside the purse was untouched, and Tiffany was still wearing several pieces of gold jewelry. Nothing had been stolen. Moreover, it seemed unlikely that such a violent act would occur over a simple mugging, especially with a shotgun involved. The aggression of the attack suggested that it was personal. But who would want to harm Tiffany, a cherished mother and respected community member? Investigators began by questioning her ex-partners and her current boyfriend. Tiffany had been separated from her former partners, Derek Andrews and Daryl Williams, for years, and any previous conflicts had long since dissipated. Her current partner, Ben, remained a mystery since Tiffany had kept their relationship private, revealing little to friends and family. Due to this secrecy, detectives felt it necessary to question him urgently. Officers arrived at Ben's house around 5 a.m. the next morning. Despite the early hour, all the lights in the house were on, and Ben was found sitting by the front door with a shotgun. The officers ordered him to drop the weapon and raise his hands, which he complied with, insisting he was not involved in the attack. He then pleaded with the officers to protect his children, explaining that he had learned about the crime just hours earlier and was fearful that the attacker might come after him next. He felt a strong need to protect his family. During the questioning, Ben shared that in the months prior to the incident, Tiffany had told him about someone she believed was stalking her. She suspected it might be her ex-fiancé, Daryl, who was also the father of her twin daughters, Diamond and Denia. Their separation had been difficult, and they were currently engaged in a custody battle over the girls. Ben confirmed his whereabouts on Halloween night with a strong alibi. He stated that he, Tiffany, and their children had gone trick-or-treating earlier that evening. Later, he took his children to visit relatives while Tiffany and the twins intended to return to their home briefly before staying the night at his place. However, she never showed up. Almost at midnight, Tiffany's oldest son called to deliver the devastating news. Once investigators verified Ben's alibi, they released him and allowed him to go home. The focus then shifted to Daryl. Was he involved in such a violent act? Detectives were skeptical. Could he really have committed something so horrific in front of his own daughters, leaving them with lifelong trauma? On November 1st, officers visited Daryl's last known address but found that he no longer lived there. Instead, they encountered his adult daughter, who informed them that her father had moved in with his new girlfriend 6 months ago. She was visibly shaken when she heard about Tiffany's tragic death and was clearly in shock. His daughter disclosed concerning information about his short temper and controlling behavior. He was known to be domineering and would become furious when things didn't go his way. Additionally, he had a strong interest in firearms and owned a shotgun. Daryl's daughter explained that her father's breakup with Tiffany had been very contentious. He harbored deep resentment over having to pay child support and had fought hard for full custody of their twins, even though he knew he had little chance of winning. However, she noted that if Tiffany were gone, he would have had a better chance of gaining custody of the girls. Her daughter described her father as ruthless and believed he was capable of committing a crime. After speaking with her, investigators went to Daryl's workplace, a large chemical plant. His supervisor spoke highly of him, describing him as a dedicated worker who could handle the workload of 2 people and was always willing to take on extra shifts. However, Daryl's aggressive demeanor often led to conflicts with coworkers, sometimes resulting in physical confrontations. Notably, on the night of November 1st, Daryl, for the first time, refused a last-minute shift change, citing personal reasons. This unusual behavior raised further suspicions, as it left him without a confirmed alibi for the night of the crime. Detectives visited the home of Daryl's new girlfriend, Rosalind. They noticed a silver Chevrolet sedan in the driveway that matched the description of a car seen near the crime scene. When Rosalind answered the door and saw the officers, she appeared nervous. However, after learning the reason for their visit, she insisted that Daryl had stayed with her all night and had not left the house. Since there was no physical evidence to hold Daryl, the investigators decided to interview the main witnesses, Daryl and Tiffany's daughters, Diamond and Denia. They were still struggling to cope with the trauma. Denia was mostly silent, experienced nightmares, and couldn't sleep without the lights on. Diamond seemed to handle things better but would break down in tears whenever the conversation shifted to that tragic night. To help them, a skilled psychologist was brought in to gently support the sisters through their trauma, and over time, they began to share their experiences. They revealed that while staying with their father, they often saw a mysterious man delivering folders of papers to him. One day, when their father stepped out, they couldn't resist their curiosity and peeked inside the folders, discovering photos of their home, pictures of their mother in various locations around town, and even images of Ben's house. This leads them to realize that their father has employed a private investigator to follow their mother, Tiffany. Even more concerning was the fact that just 2 days before Tiffany's death, she had won full custody of the twins in court, requiring Daryl to pay child support, a situation he strongly opposed. With this new evidence, the police obtained a warrant for Daryl's arrest. Given his known history with firearms and the likelihood that he might resist, the officers decided it would be safer to arrest him at work, where security was tight, minimizing the risk of an armed confrontation. When the officers arrived, Daryl appeared shocked but did not resist arrest. He calmly allowed them to handcuff him and requested to speak with a lawyer. Initially, both he and Rosalind denied any involvement in the crime. However, investigators found phone records and GPS data showing they were both near the crime scene that night. Rosalind was the first to cooperate. In exchange for a lighter sentence, she agreed to testify against Daryl, stating that she had not known his exact intentions, she had merely driven him to the location and waited in the car. When she heard a loud noise, she panicked and drove off but slowed down to let Daryl jump in before fleeing. She claimed that she later provided him with an alibi out of fear for her own safety. Daryl faced charges of first-degree homicide, which could lead to the death penalty. In an attempt to escape this severe punishment, he tried to shift the blame. Upon learning that Rosalind had testified against him, he accused her of having an affair with his adult son and claimed that they had conspired to frame him. He was willing to implicate his own son in a serious crime to save himself. However, investigators quickly disproved his claims by thoroughly examining the evidence and confirming that his son had no involvement in the events of that night. With no alternatives available, Daryl eventually accepted a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. In April 2017, at the age of 49, he was found guilty and sentenced to 50 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after at least 25 years. One morning in September 2019, police arrived at a quiet home in Pennsylvania to check on someone who had not been responding to calls. From the outside, everything seemed normal. Both the windows were closed and the curtains were drawn, but no one answered the door. When the officers entered the house, they were unsettled by what they found: blood on the floors, towels soaked with stains, and obvious signs of violence. As they moved upstairs, they were confronted with a scene much worse than they had anticipated. Margaret Sumney was born on June 28, 1952, in Pittsburgh. She grew up in her family's dance studio, a lively center of creativity that was beloved by the community. The studio was more than just a place of work, it was like a second home to her. Eventually, Margaret became a ballet instructor, helping to manage the studio and organizing beloved Christmas performances that turned into a local tradition. Her warmth and enthusiasm left a significant impact on everyone she encountered. With a magnetic personality, she always appeared polished, composed. Despite life's challenges, Margaret remained resilient and purposeful. In her early adulthood, Margaret married. Unfortunately, their relationship quickly fell apart due to his emotional unavailability and irresponsibility. After their divorce, Margaret became a single mother to 2 daughters. With no help from their father, she took on all the responsibilities of parenting while also working at the studio. Despite these challenges, she provided a loving and structured home for her daughters. Years later, Margaret met another man, a charming dentist and Harvard graduate. His charisma and apparent commitment gave Margaret the stability she had been seeking. They married in 1986, created a life filled with financial security and comfort in a well-furnished home in Pennsylvania. In 1989, they welcomed a son, David Sumney. Her husband actively participated in raising David, and he also developed a strong bond with Margaret's daughters. Although their blended family seemed to thrive on the outside, the reality inside the home was different. David was raised without boundaries. From a young age, all his wishes were immediately fulfilled, whether it was toys, vacations, or treats. As he grew older, he started demanding them, learning how to manipulate others to get what he wanted. Even simple tasks became negotiable, and he refused to do them without a reward. He had no understanding of gratitude or responsibility, his only concern was his own benefit. One particularly alarming incident occurred when he found a bird in the backyard and squeezed it to death. Margaret was horrified by his complete lack of remorse, nervously joked with family members about him potentially becoming a criminal. However, her humor masked her genuine concern. David showed no empathy or guilt. Without intervention, these troubling traits only became more pronounced as he grew older. By 2001, Margaret's marriage had quietly ended in divorce, which, while amicable, brought an end to the stability Margaret had worked so hard to achieve. Financially, the family fell apart. Her husband stopped providing support, and the dance studio that had once been central to their lives was no longer viable, forcing Margaret to close it down. With limited resources, she took a job at a clothing store to meet basic needs, a humble but necessary step. Meanwhile, David's sense of entitlement grew. Despite the family's financial struggles, he continued to expect special treatment and exhibited unchanged behavior. Even while dealing with his own financial issues, his father financially supported him at a significant personal cost, justifying it as a way to maintain their fragile bond and often giving in to his son's demands. Although Margaret and her husband no longer lived together, they remained emotionally connected, trapped in a cycle of responding to David's volatile moods. He moved easily between both homes, exploiting their desire for harmony and love. Over the years, David's influence over his parents intensified. Despite their declining finances, increasing instability, neither parent adjusted their approach. The family dynamic had shifted completely, with their lives revolving around managing their son's feelings and minimizing his outbursts. In 2008, at 19 years old, David began studying mathematics at George Washington University. His parents, who had faced many hardships, were hopeful that higher education and a structured setting would improve his behavior. Despite the high costs of housing, tuition, and living expenses, his parents supported him financially. In 2010, Margaret visited Washington, D.C. to see her son. During this visit, she called her daughter, Ellen, from a hospital, claiming that David had attempted to harm himself with a knife and that she had injured her head in the process. However, Margaret's account was inconsistent. She was evasive, defensive about the details. When Ellen arrived, she found her mother and brother in different hospital rooms, which was unusual and unexplained. The medical staff were not forthcoming with information. Ellen started to worry that David's violent behavior had escalated, possibly directed at their mother. Despite her concerns, no investigation was initiated, and the incident went unexamined. Soon after, David was expelled from the university due to ongoing absenteeism and repeated rule violations. This news devastated his parents, as all their emotional, financial, and psychological efforts had ended in another failure. David returned to Pennsylvania, shuttling between his parents' homes without showing any signs of improvement. In July 2015, 26-year-old David hit a new low in his life. He was unemployed, lacked motivation, and depended entirely on his parents. When he asked his father for a substantial amount of money for a vacation and was turned down, things escalated violently. David physically assaulted his father, viciously beating him in their home. Neighbors, disturbed by the noise, called the police. Upon arrival, the officers found David on top of his father, hitting him. His father suffered severe injuries, including brain hemorrhaging, spinal damage, and significant internal injuries. As a result, he was left unable to walk or care for himself and had to be moved to a long-term nursing facility. David was arrested at the scene and charged with aggravated assault. He was released shortly after posting bail. The father he nearly killed could no longer communicate for himself. Despite the violent attack, David faced minimal consequences. With little legal opposition and a family too shattered to resist, he walked away free, unchanged, unrepentant, more emboldened than ever. Afterward, he began telling people that he had joined the U.S. Navy. Although this story seemed odd, Margaret held on to it. For her, the idea of military service represented hope, a structured, disciplined path that could save her son from his troubled state. However, there was no evidence of any enlistment. He didn't provide any documents, wear a uniform, or answer questions about his claimed service. Every time someone asked, his responses were vague and unverifiable. At the same time, David was undergoing a physical transformation. He became obsessed with strength training, quickly gaining a lot of muscle. Now nearly 6.5 feet tall and heavily built, he appeared as intimidating as his behavior had become. As his physical strength increased, his aggression followed suit. David grew more unpredictable, volatile. Conversations with him were filled with hostility, subtle threats, and direct attempts to control those around him. He made it clear that any pushback would be met with force. Margaret, exhausted from years of fear, confusion, and love. She stayed by his side, still hoping for the return of the son she once knew. But by then, control was lost for her and the rest of the family. David was no longer just difficult or spoiled, he had become dangerous. No one seemed able or willing to stop him. In November 2016, another terrifying incident occurred at Margaret's home. Late one night, David, who was very drunk, entered her bedroom and began to strangle her while she slept. The attack was sudden and violent. Due to his large size and strength, Margaret struggled to fight back. However, she managed to break free and scream for help. David left the room without saying anything, returned to his own. Margaret then called the police. When they arrived, they found David asleep, smelling strongly of alcohol. Margaret had visible bruises, finger marks on her neck and ribs. She recounted the attack to the officers, mentioning that David had referred to a Navy SEAL reference. David was arrested, and the situation was classified as domestic violence with aggravating factors. However, Margaret intervened again. Concerned that a felony charge would jeopardize her son's future, she urged the prosecutors to lessen the charges. She argued that he was under the influence and needed rehabilitation instead of imprisonment. She also pushed the idea, though unverified, that David had served in the U.S. Navy, presenting it as a sign of his potential. Her plea was convincing enough for the court to reduce the felony charge to a lesser offense, allowing David to avoid severe punishment. During court proceedings, an official background check revealed a shocking truth: David had never served in any branch of the military. The story he had told for years was entirely false. There was no record of him being recruited, enlisted, or trained. His military persona was a deliberate lie, used to hide his failures and violent tendencies. Despite this, Margaret still believed her son could change. David received a 16-month sentence, marking his first genuine consequence. While in prison, he portrayed himself as someone struggling with addiction, rather than his aggressive behavior. He claimed that alcohol was the source of his problems, not a lack of empathy or violent impulses. This approach worked for him. A social worker supported his transfer to a rehabilitation facility instead of prison, and the court granted it. At the Pennsylvania Recovery Center, David was put under structured supervision. He participated in therapy sessions and group activities. Margaret visited regularly, bringing supplies and defending her son. She saw the rehabilitation as a potential turning point. She hoped that if he completed the program, the worst would be behind him. After finishing treatment, David moved into transitional housing, quickly got a job. Progress reports indicated that he followed the rules and showed signs of adjustment. To his hopeful family, he appeared reformed. However, this appearance was only skin deep. Beneath the good behavior was the same manipulative person. David never truly accepted responsibility for his past, never showed genuine remorse, and never acknowledged the pain he caused. By 2018, David Summey's carefully crafted image was beginning to fall apart, though not fast enough for anyone to notice. In August, his father passed away at the age of 74 in a Pennsylvania nursing home. The official cause of death was listed as age-related health issues. However, those who knew the family understood that the real reason stemmed from a severe beating he suffered in 2015 at the hands of his son. This violent act resulted in the loss of his independence, ability to work, and dignity. His health steadily declined, could not be reversed. While the family never discussed it openly, there was a shared understanding that David's attack had dramatically altered his father's identity. Throughout this time, David faced no new charges and felt no remorse. At the funeral, Margaret remained composed and did not speak out against her son, which created tension among family members. They were baffled as to why she would continue to protect someone who had caused such pain. For them, it was not just a personal tragedy, but also a systemic failure. They believed law enforcement acted too late, the courts were too lenient, and Margaret's instinct to protect may have allowed a dangerous individual to continue endangering others. In 2019, David started a new relationship using a dating app. The woman moved in with him shortly after they met. At first, he seemed to have changed for the better. He was charming, respectful, and attentive. However, this behavior didn't last long. He soon became controlling and aggressive, closely monitoring her actions, imposing strict rules in their home. She noticed something troubling. David was writing checks in the name of his mother, Margaret. He claimed that Margaret had mental health issues and that he was handling her finances, even going so far as to forge her signature when necessary. However, there was no legal documentation, such as a power of attorney or a court order, to back up his claims. When his girlfriend voiced her concerns, he dismissed them, saying there were delays with the paperwork. Although she suspected he was committing fraud, she did not have enough evidence to report him to the authorities. As their relationship deteriorated and she prepared to leave, David reacted with anger. Fearing rejection, he insisted she meet him at a hotel in Atlantic City. Once there, he became abusive. Over several days, he physically attacked her, strangled her until she lost consciousness, and kept her captive without any means to get help. At one point, believing he had killed her, he abandoned the room. She lay injured and unresponsive until a concerned housekeeper, troubled by the prolonged "do not disturb" sign, entered the room. The housekeeper discovered that she was alive, but in critical condition. She was taken to the hospital, and the police began an investigation. On July 16, 2019, an arrest warrant for David was issued, but due to a crucial mistake, the warrant wasn't entered into the federal database. This oversight allowed David to return to Pennsylvania without being identified as a fugitive. Days later, he was arrested on unrelated charges but was released because the warrant was not in the system. The protective measures designed to help the woman. The failure to communicate between agencies led to tragic outcomes. On September 1, 2019, one of Margaret's sisters tried to contact her several times, but her calls went unanswered. Worried, she contacted Margaret's eldest daughter, Ellen, who was also unable to reach her mother. By the morning of September 2, Ellen's anxiety grew as she continued trying to contact Margaret. Eventually, David answered the phone and stated that Margaret was asleep, refusing to let her speak to anyone. His tone was emotionless, which worried her. Ellen decided to contact local authorities to request a welfare check. When the police arrived at Margaret's home, everything seemed quiet. The windows were shut, and no one answered the door. After a few minutes, the officers forced their way inside and immediately sensed that something was amiss. A foul odor filled the air, blood stains were visible in several rooms, and there were drag marks suggesting an attempt to clean up or conceal something. Upstairs, they found Margaret in the bathtub. She had been dead for over 24 hours. She suffered broken ribs, a broken spine, cuts to her face and bruising all over her body. An autopsy report concluded that Margaret Summy died from blunt force trauma and her death was declared a homicide. Blood was on the walls and floors. In the hallway, investigators discovered a sickle with what appeared to be blood on it. The revolver that belonged to Margaret was missing, leaving only its empty ammunition box behind. Forensic experts carefully analyzed the scene. The amount of blood, attempts to clean up, and the arrangement of items suggested that this was not just a violent incident, but also a well-planned one. This was not an impulsive act, it was intentional and methodical. When questioned by police, David Summy denied any involvement in his mother's death. Instead, he said it was likely an accident or a drug overdose. When detectives described Ms. Summy's injuries, David Summy suggested that his mother had been dating a man and that he should be investigated. However, when police downloaded the contents of Summy's cell phone, they found hundreds of pictures of his mother being beaten to death. Assistant District Attorney Michael Pradines said the first photo was taken at 4:50 a.m. on August 30th. Interspersed among many of the victims' photos are selfies of the defendant, in which the defendant is seen with his face covered in blood, and in one photo he is seen giving a thumbs up, the prosecutor said. Pradines said investigators also found a video on his phone recorded at 2:41 a.m. on September 1, 2019, of David Sumney washing his mother's body in the bathtub. In addition to the photos, his browsing history provided incriminating information. He had searched for ways to clean blood from surfaces, how human bodies decompose, and strategies to avoid detection in homes. David conducted searches on his phone at 11:11 a.m. on August 30th, 2019, including the phrase, "How long does it take before a body starts to decompose?" He had also looked up chemical odor neutralizers and information on mummification. Rather than panicking, David had planned ahead. The brutality of the crime and the calculated nature of his actions painted a psychological picture of someone without a conscience, remorse, or restraint. Investigators were certain of his guilt, but their challenge was to apprehend him. Police reached out to Ellen, the only person still occasionally in touch with David, asked for her assistance in setting a trap. She agreed. When he showed up, officers arrested him immediately. They found Margaret's checks and pieces of her jewelry among his belongings. He was formally charged with third-degree murder, abuse of a corpse, theft, and related offenses. A psychiatric evaluation determined that he was fit to stand trial. November 17, 2022, David pleaded guilty to third-degree murder, admitted his guilt, and received a sentence of 20 to 40 years in prison. With time already served, he would be eligible for parole in 2039, around his 50th birthday. David also faces another criminal case in Atlantic City, where his ex-girlfriend said he waterboarded and strangled her in a hotel room in July 2019. For Margaret's surviving relatives, this outcome felt like a betrayal. Given the horror of the crime, the photographic evidence, the forensic findings, and the digital trace, they believed he should have faced harsher charges. Margaret's daughters and sisters publicly criticized the deal and called the sentence insufficient. Ellen said, "For someone who seems to enjoy killing people, with a history of violence, he should never be out in society again." In court, David made a short statement where he expressed regret and claimed he couldn't comprehend how he committed his actions. However, his apology felt insincere. For Margaret Sumney's family, this was not a moment of madness. It was the tragic culmination of a lifetime filled with manipulation, abuse, and ignored warning signs. Margaret's life ended not abruptly, but following a prolonged and preventable decline. She was not killed by a stranger, but by the very child she had always stood up for. Ellen has cut all ties with her brother, who is now a convicted murderer and no longer resembles the family member she once knew. What remains is not only profound grief but also the heavy burden of realizing that this tragedy could have been avoided. The tragic murder of Margaret Sumney is a harrowing reminder of the devastating consequences of unchecked violence and systemic failures. Margaret, a loving mother, ballet teacher, and pillar of her Pennsylvania community, endured years of increasingly violent assault, manipulation, and abuse at the hands of her son, culminating in her brutal death. Despite numerous warning signs, from David's lack of empathy as a child to his violent attacks on his father and mother, the continued leniency of the legal system and Margaret's unwavering hope for redemption allowed his dangerous behavior to continue. The gruesome evidence, including photographs and videos David took during the crime, revealed a calculated and remorseless act, but his plea agreement to third-degree murder and his 20 to 40-year sentence left Margaret's family feeling betrayed by a justice system that failed to deliver proportionate consequences. This case highlights the urgent need for early intervention in cases of domestic violence, stricter enforcement of legal accountability, and increased awareness of manipulative behaviors that can escalate into tragedy. Margaret's legacy, defined by her warmth and resilience, lives on in the memories of those she touched, but her story is a wake-up call to prevent such preventable losses in the future. In abusive relationships, one person frequently displays cruelty, aggression, and disrespect towards the other, whether they are a partner, spouse, family member, or coworker. Those who show these harmful behaviors are often labeled as hot-headed or incapable of managing their emotions. However, the more insidious type of abuse is the one that remains hidden, leading others to believe the family is perfect until a tragedy strikes. The relationship between Olsu Sabishnikova and Timur Prokhorov was viewed by many as a shining example of love, understanding, and support. They both grew up in the small rural community and met during their school years. After several years of dating, they appeared to be meant for each other. They had an extravagant wedding, with relatives traveling from far and wide to celebrate. However, just 3 days after their wedding, the newlyweds were laid to rest in the same grave at the local cemetery. What happened? Let's unravel this complex case. Olsu Sabishnikova, later known as Prokhorova, was born on 2001 in Maliks, a village of Tatarstan. She was the youngest of 2 children, with her older brother Rusin always looking out for her. When Olsu and Rusin were still in school, their parents divorced. They lived with their mother. Shortly after, their mother remarried, and the family moved to her new husband's home. Olsu and Rusin accepted their mother's new life, quickly bonded with their stepfather, who treated them like his own children. They began calling him Dad. At the new house, Olsu and Rusin adjusted quickly, enrolled in the local school, and made many friends. Life in the village was calm and peaceful, unlike the busyness of larger cities. The community consisted mainly of Russians, Tatars, and Uzbeks. The local community center hosted weekly dances, offered classes in performing arts, dancing, and choral singing. Concerts showcasing local talent were common during holidays. Olsu was an outstanding student, consistently earning straight A's. Her teachers praised her intelligence, responsibility, seriousness, and determination. She was reliable and known for her calm demeanor, often acting as a diplomat to peacefully resolve conflicts. Additionally, her beauty and kindness attracted many friends who wanted to be close to her. Her closest friend throughout childhood was her cousin, Sabrina Sabishnikova, who was 3 years younger. Despite the age difference, they felt like sisters, constantly in touch and sharing their deepest secrets. Sadly, both would face a tragic fate. From a young age, Olsu faced significant health issues. She suffered from a severe viral infection that damaged her kidneys, leading to chronic kidney failure that worsened over time. Olsu had to regularly visit a specialized clinic for treatment and supportive care, including numerous hemodialysis sessions, as her kidneys could no longer function properly. The financial burden of her ongoing medical care was heavy for the Sabishnikova family, who were not wealthy. During difficult periods of her illness, Olsu had to switch to homeschooling, which often caused her to miss several months of school. Consequently, she struggled to prepare adequately for her graduation and entrance exams for higher education. Despite facing many challenges, Olsu aspired to further her education and hoped to attend the Naborozni Chelny branch of Kazan Innovative University to study economics. However, she recognized that her health issues would make it difficult to manage university life. Additionally, most of her family's budget was spent on her treatments and medications, making it hard for her to pay for tuition. Her mother encouraged her to consider starting at a vocational college to learn a skill that would provide a stable income, allowing her to defer university for a time. Olsu focused on staying positive and was determined to find a career she loved, aiming to become independent and not a burden on her family. She remained hopeful about the future and actively sought her path. She completed courses in eyelash extension and nail care, beginning to take clients at home, which suited her health needs. While in school, Olsu met Timur Prokhorov, an older student who was 4 years her senior. They quickly formed a strong friendship that eventually developed into a romantic relationship. Timur Prokhorov was born in 1997 in Naborozni Chelny as the younger of 2 sons in a relatively affluent family. His parents owned a small but successful business, which provided a comfortable income and allowed them to prioritize their children's education. Timur has an older brother, Artur, with whom he shares a close bond. Artur earned a law degree and currently works for the Ministry of Internal Affairs. In the late 2000s, the Prokhorov family bought land in the village of Maliks and began constructing their home. A few years later, they moved to the area with their children and settled in. Timur and his brother assisted their parents with building, finishing the house, as well as with household chores. According to friends, teachers, and community members, Timur was known for his kindness and level-headedness. He avoided conflict, preferred peaceful resolution through negotiation. He was willing to admit his mistakes, would apologize when necessary. In school, Timur was a good but not exceptional student. He participated in local arts, danced in a group, and performed at the community center, continuing these activities into adulthood. Timur's older brother got married while he was in university and moved back to Naborozni Chelny. Soon after, they had 2 children and frequently visited their relatives in Malik's. The nieces and nephews adored their uncle and treasured their time together. Timur felt the same way, often pampering them, enjoying their company. After completing school, Timur joined the military service in the Navy. At that time, he was dating Alsu, who was eagerly waiting for his return. Unfortunately, Timur's mother was diagnosed with a severe form of cancer. Despite all attempts to treat her, she soon declined and passed away within a few months. A year later, Timur's father remarried, and his new wife was embraced by the family. The adult children formed a strong bond with her, accepting her as one of their own. About 6 months later, Timur's father and stepmother returned to Naborozni Chelny to focus on their business. They gave their nearly completed house in the village to their younger son, who continued to work on it himself. When Alsu and Timur met in high school, their feelings for each other grew quickly. Alsu was honest about her serious health problems, but this didn't discourage Timur. He assured her they would face the challenges together. After completing his military service, Timur resumed his studies and later joined his family's business. He earned enough to support both himself and Alsu, but Alsu didn't want to rely on anyone, so she continued to work hard from home. Unfortunately, due to her health condition, she had to stop doing nail extensions because she could no longer work with most materials. Timur was very caring towards Alsu. He drove her to Naborozni Chelny and Kazan for her medical checkups, treatments, and therapies. He looked after her with great affection and concern. He got along well with Alsu's mother, who considered him like her own son. In 2018, Alsu's health began to decline rapidly. Her kidneys were failing. She needed regular dialysis to survive. The only hope for her was a kidney transplant. Fortunately, her mother was a perfect match and could be her donor, but the surgery and post-operative care were too expensive for the family to afford. Alsu found herself in a desperate situation, facing the possibility of death. Due to severe swelling, her face became almost unrecognizable, causing her great distress about her appearance. She didn't want Timur to see her in that state, even tried to prevent him from visiting her in the hospital. However, Timur was determined to stay by her side. The news of Alsu's critical condition and the urgent need for costly surgery quickly spread throughout the town. Concerned neighbors rallied to help in any way they could. They organized a charity concert at the local community center, with all proceeds going to support Alsu's family. Timur even performed that night with a dance group. Thanks to the community's efforts, they raised enough money in a short time to cover the life-saving surgery. Alsu and her mother traveled to a renowned clinic in Moscow, where a skilled surgeon agreed to take on her challenging case. The surgery was successful, and both women handled it well, but also faced a lengthy recovery process. She needed to take medications regularly, adhere to a strict diet, and attend frequent checkups to monitor the function of her transplanted kidney. Alsu spent almost 6 months in the hospital, followed by another year at home to minimize the risk of infection, as even a simple cold could have been life-threatening in her vulnerable condition. Despite the physical and emotional challenges, she diligently followed the doctor's recommendations. Her mother, stepfather, and brother provided constant support, encouraging her to remain positive, believe that things would improve. They were also very concerned about her relationship with Timur. Not every young man can handle a partner's health issues. If Timur had chosen to leave, no one would have criticized him, but he was determined to stay by Alsu's side. During Alsu's illness, Timur was constantly at the hospital, staying by her side and later at her parents' home. He was always willing to assist, taking her to medical appointments, even traveling to another city to find necessary medication. Soon after Alsu was discharged from the clinic, Timur proposed to her, and she joyfully accepted. In August 2021, Alsu and Timur had their nikah ceremony, an important religious event in Islam that symbolizes their union, similar to a Christian wedding. Following this, they moved into the groom's house, which was still under construction. While Alsu worked from home, Timur commuted daily to his job in Naborozni Chelny. They were saving money for a grand wedding, which they planned to have in January. Alsu turned 21 on January 4, 2022, and they celebrated their wedding at her parents' house on January 20th. Family and friends from all over the Republic gathered to celebrate. Everyone wished the newlyweds a long and happy life together. The festivities lasted for 3 days. Guests noted how joyful and radiant Timur and Alsu appeared. Timur expressed his wish to call Alsu's mother, Mom. Alsu's mother, moved to tears, thanked God and fate for bringing such a wonderful husband to her daughter and a son-in-law into her life. Alsu's bridesmaid was Sabrina, an 18-year-old. She had to return for school on January 23. Sabrina stayed in a private room at Timur's home. Other guests were hosted at Alsu's parents' house and at the homes of nearby relatives since there were no hotels in the village or the surrounding areas. On the morning of January 23, Alsu's mother had a distressing dream in which she was unable to find her daughter. In the dream, her son-in-law quietly placed small coins into her hands. She woke up around 5 a.m. feeling very anxious and was unable to go back to sleep. Although she wanted to call her daughter, Alsu, she decided to wait since it was still early. By 7 a.m., she couldn't wait any longer and called her daughter, but no one answered. She also tried reaching Sabrina and Timur, but they didn't pick up either. Concerned, she and her husband chose to go to Prokhorov's house. When they arrived around 7:30 a.m., they noticed Timur's car was missing from the driveway. Initially, this didn't raise alarms, but when Alsu's mother tried the door and found it unlocked, panic began to set in. It seemed impossible for her daughter, son-in-law, and sister to leave the house without locking it. She entered her home, calling out for her daughter and son-in-law, but received no answer. As she stepped into the living room, she was overwhelmed by a horrifying sight. The lifeless bodies of Alsu and Sabrina lay on the floor, surrounded by pools of blood. Both women had been stabbed multiple times with a sharp object. It was evident they had died several hours prior, as their bodies were cold and stiff. In shock, she screamed, rushed outside to alert her husband. He quickly called the police and emergency services. Authorities arrived at 7:50 a.m. Meanwhile, Alsu's mother began experiencing heart problems, needed medical help. Distraught and unable to think clearly, she cried and screamed, struggling to accept that her daughter was gone. By this time, relatives of the young couple had arrived at the house. Neighbors were gathering due to the noise. Forensic experts discovered more than a dozen stab wounds on the bodies of Alsu and Sabrina, which were caused by a knife and scissors. However, the actual murder weapons were not found in the house. The primary suspect became Timur. As he was missing, his phone was unreachable. His relatives quickly came to his defense, claiming he could not have committed such a crime. All witnesses, including family and nearby residents, consistently described Timur as a loving and devoted husband who treated his wife with utmost care. According to them, Timur and Alsu rarely had arguments. If they did disagree, Timur would never resort to violence against someone he loved so deeply. However, some neighbors later asserted that Timur was a concealed abuser. They claimed he was extremely jealous of his attractive wife and that their private arguments were sometimes audible to others. Alsu had felt guilty about her illness, and Timur allegedly told her that no one else would take care of her except him. The night before the tragedy, Timur and his friends were at his house, enjoying drinks and staying up late on a Saturday. When it was time to say goodbye to his guests, it was already past midnight. Timur then was missing for nearly an hour and a half. During this time, Alsu sent a text to her friend, expressing her concern because she couldn't reach Timur, who had left his phone behind. At 2 a.m., Alsu messaged her friend again, saying that Timur had returned safely, everything was all right, and they were going to bed. She thanked her friend for her worry and included a smiley face. Those messages didn't raise any alarms, everything seemed normal. Investigators later speculated that Timur might have become jealous of someone also was in contact with, leading to a heated argument when he returned. Having been drinking that evening, it's believed he may have lost control and grabbed a knife. Realizing the gravity of his actions, he likely fled in his car, prompting authorities to track him down to uncover the details of the incident. On January 23, reports surfaced about a car found in a parking lot near a small roadside cafe along the road to Yelabuga. Inside the vehicle was the body of a young man who had died from a gunshot wound to the chin. A rifle was found in his hands, suggesting he had taken his own life. The deceased was quickly identified as 25-year-old Timur Prokhorov, who had been wanted for questioning in connection with a double murder. Later, it was discovered that the rifle belonged to Timur's father and was stored in a secure safe at the home where Timur lived with his wife. It seems Timur took the weapon with him when he left that night, possibly already planning to end his own life. Authorities obtained footage from a security camera located on a building across from the Prokhorov residence. The video showed Timur leaving the house with friends. About an hour and a half later, he returned alone but disappeared from the camera's view afterward. It's important to mention that the camera was aimed at the street, so Timur might have left in the opposite direction, out of sight. A witness remembered that on the night of January 23, a local club nearby was holding a dance event. However, Timur and Alsa did not attend because they had guests. At one point, an unfamiliar car arrived at their house but then drove away shortly after. The next morning, after news of the tragedy broke, two young men came searching for Timur. When they found out what had happened, they quickly left, and no one could provide any details about them later. During the investigation, a 64-year-old massage therapist became a person of interest. It was later discovered that she also offered intimate services in her home. While her name was kept out of the media, it was alleged that Timur had visited her multiple times. On the night of the tragedy, Timur sent her a text asking if he could come over for a session. She wasn't surprised by his late-night request, said she would be waiting for him. Some reports suggest that Timur met with the massage therapist after he had already harmed his wife and Sabrina. They had an intimate encounter, but when she asked for payment, Timur refused. She threatened to report him, but instead of apologizing, he became angry, insulted her, and assaulted her several times before leaving. The woman later reported a physical assault to the police, claiming that Timur also assaulted her. However, she eventually retracted her statement for reasons that are not clear. There were rumors suggesting that Timur's well-connected relatives, including some in law enforcement, intervened to resolve the situation. It is said they kept the massage therapist's identity secret, and she never talked about her relationship with Timur or the abuse she endured. Speculation arose that Timur had seen the massage therapist before the incident, which might explain his prolonged absence that night. After he returned home, a jealousy-fueled argument may have occurred between him and his wife. This conflict could have escalated, leading Timur to grab a knife and attack both women. At 7:03 a.m. on January 23, Timur logged into his social media account for the last time. After that, he stopped answering calls and messages, marking this time as the approximate moment of his death. The theories of infidelity, jealousy, and sudden rage did not match Timur's character as described by those who knew him. Even Alsu's family dismissed these ideas, insisting that the crime was committed by someone outside. Timur was seen by friends as kind, calm, thoughtful, and balanced, making his violent actions surprising. Although he might have had a drink on his days off or during holidays, no one ever saw him drunk. However, during a search of his home, investigators discovered a large quantity of prescription painkillers that had been prescribed to Timur's mother, who had cancer. After her passing, many strong medications remained in the house, which appeared to have been used periodically, as they were not thrown away and were organized in a separate drawer. This new information suggests another theory: Timur might have secretly used these medications. On that night, he could have taken a large dose combined with strong alcohol, which may have caused hallucinations or intense anger. If this happened, the crimes could have been committed while he was not fully himself. Once he regained his senses and understood the gravity of his actions, He might have felt that ending his own life was his only option. No criminal case was opened regarding the death of the individual believed to have committed the crime. However, the relatives of Timur and also struggled to accept that Timur was responsible for such a violent act. At the request of Alsu's mother, the young couple was buried together in the same grave at the local cemetery. She insisted that her son-in-law would never have harmed her daughter, as he loved her deeply, believed they should remain together even in death. News of this tragic double death spread rapidly through the quiet village, causing a wave of shock throughout the entire Republic of Tatarstan. Journalists from across the region flocked to report on the sensational story, but the Prokhorov and Sabashnikova families chose not to speak to the media. In contrast, many villagers, most of whom did not even know the couple, were eager to give interviews, often sharing strange rumors and gossip. Consequently, the case became muddled with inaccurate information, much of which was far from the truth. On January 26, Timur's father gave an interview in which he stated that the autopsy had revealed signs of physical abuse on his son's body and noted that there was very little blood found in the car. This led him to believe that Timur might have been beaten and shot elsewhere before his body was placed in the car. However, the next day, investigators publicly contradicted the father's claims, confirming that the only injury on Timur's body was the gunshot wound. This wound was located under the chin and at a specific angle, suggesting that Timur likely died by ending one's own life. The tragic deaths of Alsu Prokhorova, Sabrina Savashnikova, and Timur Prokhorov shattered the illusion of a perfect love story that had captivated their communities. What began as a joyous celebration of Alsu and Timur's wedding ended in unimaginable violence, exposing the underlying complexities of their relationship. The loss of 3 young lives left families and neighbors grappling with grief, disbelief, and unanswered questions about the motives behind Timur's actions. As the Republic of Tatarstan mourned, the case highlighted the brutal reality of hidden abuse, reminding us that even the most idyllic appearances can mask deep pain. The scars of this tragedy remain, prompting greater awareness and compassion to prevent such heartbreak in the future. The Shafia family fled war and instability, hoping to build a new life in Canada. They were originally from Afghanistan, a country where traditions dictate fate, family honor outweighs personal freedom. On the surface, they appeared to be an ordinary immigrant family, a father who had achieved financial success, 2 wives, and 7 children. However, behind this image of prosperity lay a harsh reality. Control, fear, and strict discipline became inseparable parts of their lives until one day, the family found itself at the center of one of the most shocking and tragic crimes in the country's history. Muhammad Shafia was born into a poor Afghan family. His father passed away when he was just 2 years old, leaving his mother to care for the household alone. From a young age, he understood that survival required resilience. Education was a luxury beyond his reach, so he started working early. At first, he helped his mother with household chores and then moved on to repairing appliances. Eventually, he realized that there were other ways to make money by buying and reselling goods for a profit. Muhammad's business quickly expanded. He dealt in electronics, furniture, and automobiles, constantly finding new ways to grow his wealth. Lacking formal education, he relied on his instincts and sharp business sense to seize every opportunity. As his financial situation improved, he felt ready to start a family. Rona came from a respected and wealthy background where her family valued traditions and ensured their daughters received an education. Although she was raised in a loving environment, her future was largely predetermined. Like many young women in her social circle, she was expected to marry whoever her parents chose for her. When her parents announced that she would marry Muhammad Shafia, she felt she had no choice but to accept their decision as her duty. The wedding took place at one of Kabul's finest hotels, featuring hundreds of guests. To outsiders, it appeared as a prestigious union between 2 noble families, yet no one considered Rona's true feelings. After the wedding, her life changed significantly. She was now expected to obey her husband, manage the household, and meet all his expectations. Years went by without any children, which caused Rona's status within the family to become unstable. In Afghan society, a woman's value is often associated with her ability to bear children. Muhammad's frustration grew, and rumors about Rona's inability to conceive began to circulate among relatives. Over time, his irritation turned into cold indifference, creating a widening gap between them. After 7 years of marriage without children, Muhammad decided to take a second wife. The second wedding took place in 1988, and many of the wedding photos show Shafia standing next to his 2 wives. The 3 lived together in one household. Tuba Yehia was younger and more obedient than Rona. Her primary value was her ability to bear children. Once she married Muhammad, she quickly gave birth to their first son, followed by another child. As time went on, Tuba's influence in the household increased, while Rona faded into the background. Muhammad enforced strict rules that everyone had to follow without question. Disobedience was met with humiliation or physical punishment. He controlled all financial matters and made decisions for the entire family, demanding total respect. The women in his home were confined to the boundaries he set. Tuba not only accepted these rules but also actively upheld them. She fully embraced her role as the main wife, completely overshadowing Rona. Tuba managed the children, the family finances, and even dictated Rona's circumstances. Over time, her treatment of Rona grew more severe. She isolated Rona, limiting her interaction with the children and restricting her personal freedoms. Hamd Shafia, the oldest son, was raised to enforce control over his sisters. He was taught to believe it was his responsibility to ensure they followed the family's rules and to report any disobedience. Zainab, Sahar, and Geethi, the sisters, lived under constant scrutiny. Any attempt to resist their father or Hamd led to punishment. They were not allowed to make friends, freely leave the house, or choose their own clothing. Muhammad viewed them not as individuals with their own dreams but as extensions of the family, expected to uphold his concept of honor. When the family relocated to Canada, many believed this would offer the children a better life. However, the family dynamics remained unchanged. If anything, the control within the household became even stricter. Muhammad recognized that his children were now in a society where women had rights, so he tightened his authority. The daughters started to notice that life beyond their home was very different from what they had always experienced. They observed their classmates engaging freely, choosing their outfits, and making decisions about their futures. Meanwhile, life at home stayed the same. Hamd took on a stricter role. He watched over his sisters to prevent them from adopting Western habits, monitored their phones, scrutinized their behavior at school, and reported everything back to their parents. Rona had hoped that moving to a new country would improve her situation, but her reality remained the same. She didn't speak the language, had no legal status, and was unemployed. Without a passport or financial independence, she was completely under her family's control. Canada did not provide the Shafia family with freedom. Instead, it became a new place where their old rules still governed their lives. Zainab, the eldest daughter of Muhammad Shafia, was the first in her family to openly rebel against their strict control. She secretly started dating Omar Wahid, a young man of Pakistani descent who was older and would never be approved by her father. Their relationship began with passing notes, progressed to email exchanges, and eventually led to secret meetings. Zainab understood the risks involved. She was constantly watched by Hamd at home and felt unsafe even at school. However, her love for Omar drove her to take these risks. When her father went on a business trip, she saw a chance to invite Omar over, thinking they wouldn't be caught. Hamd soon noticed a pair of unfamiliar shoes in the hallway, quickly realizing someone was in the house. He immediately reported it to their parents. Although Omar managed to escape, Zainab faced severe repercussions. She was physically punished and confined to her room for several months, barred from going outside. During her isolation, Sahar attempted to carve out her independence in a different manner. Instead of openly rebelling, she subtly distanced herself from her family's traditional expectations. At school, she took off her headscarf, wore makeup, and dressed in ways her family prohibited. She also grew close to Ricardo Sanchez, a young man from Honduras who was very different from the type of husband her parents would want for her. Sahar yearned for freedom and carefully planned her escape. She and Ricardo talked about moving to another country where her family couldn't find her. Her plan was to make it look like she had gone to Honduras, while in reality, she intended to cross into the United States. However, her plans took an unexpected turn one evening. While dining at a cafe with Ricardo, she spotted her brother watching her from another table. He didn't approach or say anything, but his presence made it clear she was in serious danger. Upon returning home, she braced for the worst, realizing her father already knew everything. There were no discussions, only punishment. After facing physical aggression, she was prohibited from attending school. Sahar came to understand that escaping would be much harder than she had thought, as it might put her life at risk. In the midst of this chaos, Geethi, the youngest sister, instead of trying to run away or seeking a secret relationship, she acted out at school. Her aggressive behavior, frequent absences, and open defiance of teachers became her form of resistance. She wanted others to recognize that something was seriously wrong at home. She was called to the principal's office, and this led to a meeting with social services. She told school staff and a youth welfare worker that she wanted to be removed from her family home. However, when her parents were invited to discuss the situation, they argued that Geethi's behavior stemmed from negative Western influences. They assured the social workers that they would take care of the issue themselves. The daughter's efforts to defy the strict family rules only worsened their situation. Their father and brother felt they had lost control over them, leading to the need for punishment. The conflict between the sisters and their family had escalated beyond repair. When Zainab, Sahar, and Geethi attempted to escape their family's control, they understood the risks, but they were shocked to find that the system meant to protect them was ineffective against their father's and brother's authority. Zainab was the first to seek help. After months of being confined at home, she understood that her only chance for survival was to leave for good. She escaped and found shelter in a facility for women in crisis. For the first time, she felt safe. However, her absence was quickly noticed. Hamed, her brother, contacted the police, claiming she had been kidnapped and accusing her friend Ammar, hoping to get him arrested. When the police found Zainab, she explained the truth: she had left to escape her family. The police did not force her to return home, but they also failed to provide her with proper protection. After witnessing what happened to her sister, Sahar sought her own way out. Although she was too scared to go directly to the police, she contacted Child Protective Services. She described the harsh restrictions, constant threats, and her fear for her life. The caseworkers listened, but ultimately decided that intervention wasn't necessary since she was nearing 18. They offered her temporary shelter, but that meant she would have to return home once her stay ended. Sahar realized that going back would lead to punishment far worse than what she had already faced. Frightened, she declined their offer. At that moment, she understood that the system could not protect her. Rona was the only one who fully grasped the serious danger the sisters faced, but she felt powerless to intervene. She lived in constant fear herself. She realized that Muhammad and Tuba no longer viewed their daughters as obedient family members, but rather as threats to the family's honor. Rona understood that trying to step in would be pointless. Within the Shafia household, it was evident that the daughters had stopped adhering to the rules set for them. They had rejected the traditional lifestyle. Their actions were not only seen as rebellious but also as a significant threat to the family's reputation. Muhammad could not let rumors about his rebellious daughters circulate among their acquaintances. In Afghan culture, such stories spread rapidly, putting the family's respect at risk. What frustrated him the most was that their defiance was happening in Canada, a place where he had less control over his daughters' lives than he did in Afghanistan. The greatest concern for the family, however, was Zainab. She hadn't just disobeyed, she had run away. This was unacceptable to them. She was living independently, making her own decisions, and no longer following her father's authority. To them, this was the ultimate act of betrayal. Tuba realized that she couldn't force Zainab to return, so she found a way to have her come back willingly. She called Zainab, convincing her that their father had changed his mind. Tuba told Zainab that he had given his blessing for her to marry Ammar, allowing them to be together officially. On May 18th, they held a religious wedding ceremony at an Islamic center. The next day, Zainab had her hair done and decorated her hands with henna. Her uncle took her to a restaurant, and on the way, He tried one last time to persuade her to think twice about the marriage, but Zainab remained resolute. However, her sense of freedom was short-lived. None of Ammar's family members attended the ceremony, as they disapproved of the marriage. Tuba was devastated, overwhelmed with embarrassment, and she collapsed from humiliation. People poured water on her to help her regain consciousness. Seeing her mother in distress, Zainab ran into her arms and said, "If you're opposed to this marriage, I'll leave him." Zainab asked for a divorce, and Ammar agreed, saying, "He can't bring shame to his family." The cleric declared them divorced right then and there in the restaurant. They had only been married for 24 hours. After the annulment, Zainab's relationship with Ammar deteriorated sharply. Pressured by her family, she had to cut off all communication with him. Her life became increasingly restricted. Her family monitored her movements and controlled her interactions. Although Ammar attempted to reach out, her relatives made it impossible for them to stay in contact. Eventually, their relationship ended entirely, adding more stress and emotional pain to Zainab's life. She realized she would never experience true freedom and lost all hope for independence. Following this situation, the tension between Zainab and her family intensified, leading to tragic consequences. This marked a turning point from which there was no return. After considering the situation for some time, their father realized that his daughters would not change their behavior or abide by the family's rules. Muhammad felt that he could not wait any longer. He believed that betrayal was unforgivable, and that women who damaged the family's honor needed to be held accountable. He thought he had been too forgiving in the past, and if they did not take action quickly, their family's reputation would be at risk. Therefore, he decided that his daughters would no longer be allowed to live. The only task remaining was to figure out how to execute this plan. Muhammad wanted to keep a low profile because he understood that a crime like this needed careful planning to appear accidental. Thus, the planning commenced. They began preparations weeks ahead of time. Muhammad, Tuba, and Hamd outlined the steps to carry out their plan. One important aspect was acquiring a second vehicle, a Nissan Sentra. Officially, it was bought for convenience, but in truth, it was essential for their scheme. It was reported that the Shafia family purchased a used Nissan Sentra for $5,000 Canadian dollars the day before the family left Montreal for Niagara Falls. This would create the illusion of a family trying to reconnect after previous conflicts. The vacation would suggest that everything was fine and that they were making efforts to improve their relationships. Zainab, Sahar, Geethi, and Rona felt they had no choice but to participate, even though they had reservations. Disputing their father's decision seemed futile. From the start of the trip, they sensed something was off, but none of them could foresee that this journey would be their last. For several days, everything unfolded as planned. The family visited attractions, took photographs, and chatted with strangers, all carefully arranged to ensure that no one would suspect any underlying tension among them. In the early hours of June 30th, 2009, two cars, a Nissan Sentra and a Lexus RX, left the Kingston East Motel and headed toward the Kingston Mills Locks. The Nissan Sentra carried Zainab, Sahar, Geethi, and Rona. It is unclear who was driving at that moment, but it was likely Zainab, as she was the oldest and had a driver's license. Following them at a short distance was Muhammad, Tuba, Hamd, and the three youngest children, in the Lexus RX. They maintained a safe distance to avoid raising any suspicions. When the Nissan Sentra parked near the locks, Muhammad got out of his car and approached the Nissan. Zainab either got out of the driver's seat voluntarily or was forced to leave. Tuba then took over the driver's seat of the Nissan, remaining inside with the girls to prevent them from feeling suspicious. With their mother beside them, the girls did not sense any immediate danger. Muhammad and Hamd returned to the Lexus and drove to a nearby motel, where they intended to create the impression that the family was merely stopping for the night before resuming their trip. At the motel, they woke the manager to rent 2 rooms, but their answers about the number of guests seemed inconsistent, which raised suspicions. After dropping off the 3 youngest family members at the motel, Muhammad and Hamd got back into the Lexus and returned to the locks. As soon as Tuba spotted their headlights in the darkness, she quickly exited the Nissan and ran towards them. This was the sign that it was time to act. At that moment, the women in car unaware they were in a dangerous situation. The events that followed can only be partially reconstructed from the investigation. It is unclear whether the victims were harmed inside or outside the car. However, forensic evidence provided important details. 3 of the victims, Rona, Geethi, and Zainab, suffered head injuries, likely inflicted to render them unconscious before they were submerged. In contrast, Sahar seemed to have fought back. There were no signs of head trauma on her body, indicating she may have remained conscious longer than the others. One by one, the victims were either drowned in the water or placed inside the car after losing consciousness. Muhammad, Toba, and Hain started to set up the scene to make it look like a tragic accident. Their plan was to push the vehicle into the water to make it seem like it had rolled in by accident. One of them started the engine, shifted the car into neutral, and got out, hoping the Nissan would roll into the canal by itself. However, things didn't go as planned. The car got stuck on the edge of the concrete ledge. The front wheels had gone over the edge, but instead of falling into the water, the vehicle stayed in place. This was a significant problem. If anyone had shown up at that moment, they would have been caught. One of them reached through the open driver's window and turned off the ignition. They realized that the Nissan wouldn't go into the water without some help. The only way to execute their plan was to use the Lexus to push the Nissan into the canal. They jumped into the Lexus, accelerated, and slammed into the back of the Nissan. The impact was powerful. The left headlight of the Lexus shattered, scattering glass at the scene. With that final push, the Nissan Sentra fell into the water, taking the 4 women with it. Thinking they had completed their crime, they started to cover their tracks. They tried to pick up the broken pieces of the Lexus's headlight but couldn't collect them all. Then, they quickly left the site and returned to the motel to create the impression that they had spent the night there and had no knowledge of the disappearance. On the morning of June 30, 2009, a worker at the Kingston Canal noticed something odd in the water. He saw the roof of a submerged car. He quickly called the authorities. Emergency responders and divers arrived to investigate. When they removed the vehicle from the water, they found the bodies of 4 women inside. None had tried to escape, there were no broken windows, and no signs of anyone attempting to open the doors. The victims were soon identified as 3 sisters and their stepmother, Rona. Zainab was in the front passenger seat, her head leaning forward, her black cardigan soaked and worn backward after hours underwater. In the back seat was her younger sister Sahar, while Geethi's lifeless body was found above the driver's seat with one arm resting on the headrest and the window next to her fully open. Rona was curled up in the middle of the back seat. None of them were wearing seat belts. The initial inspection of the car raised immediate concerns. The seat belts were unused, which was odd. During an emergency, people usually grab onto something for safety, yet there were no signs of a struggle. Meanwhile, 3 individuals walked into the Kingston police station: Muhammad Shafia, his wife Toba, and their son Hamed. They reported that 4 women were missing, claiming that the women had taken the car keys during the night and left without permission. They suggested that the most likely reason for their disappearance was an attempted escape that went wrong. Initially, their story seemed plausible. The family mentioned that Zainab and Sahar had a history of defiance and conflicts with their parents. They reasoned that if the women tried to run away, they might have panicked, lost control of the car, and accidentally driven into the water. However, the first pieces of evidence soon raised doubts about this narrative. First, the car was found in a Kingston Canal, which is not a road or highway and impossible to access by accident without knowledge of the area. Second, the condition of the bodies was concerning. If the women had been alive when the car entered the water, they would have tried to escape, yet there were no signs of struggle, no scratches on the windows or attempts to open the doors. This prompted investigators to reevaluate the family's account, and the theory of an accidental crash began to unravel. Detectives began examining statements from the motel staff where the Shafia family had stayed. They discovered that no one saw the women enter the building and surveillance cameras did not record them leaving. This raised suspicions, indicating that someone was definitely lying. While the police proceeded with their investigation thoughtfully and without jumping to conclusions, it became evident early on that this situation was not merely a tragic accident, it appeared to be a carefully orchestrated crime disguised as one. During questioning, Muhammad, Toba, and Haim struggled with details. At first, they claimed the women had left during the night, but when asked for the exact time, none of them could provide a clear answer. Their statements about when they supposedly left kept changing. Haim insisted that he had been asleep and hadn't heard anything, while Toba claimed there had been noise in the house that night. Later, she added that she had woken up and seen the women leaving, only to contradict herself by saying she didn't remember. Muhammad initially stated that he had been in a different motel room at the time, but security footage showed otherwise. Police conducted a thorough examination of the car found in the water. At the scene, they discovered fragments of broken headlights. However, these fragments did not belong to the submerged vehicle. This meant that another car had been present and could have played a role in the incident. Forensic experts took a closer look at the front of the family's Lexus SUV. The damage patterns on the vehicle matched the broken fragments found at the scene. Further analysis revealed that the Lexus had dents and impact marks consistent with a collision with another car. These findings confirmed a new theory: the victims had not simply been left in the vehicle, they had been deliberately pushed into the water. Investigators knew they needed stronger evidence, so they decided to place a listening device in the Shafia family's vehicle, hoping the suspects would incriminate themselves. A few days later, the police got exactly what they were looking for. The recordings captured conversations in which Muhammad openly expressed satisfaction with what had happened. He stated that his daughters had brought shame to the family and that honor had been restored. Tuba supported his words, saying they had done what was necessary. Haim, meanwhile, repeatedly insisted that their actions had been justified. These recordings became key pieces of evidence. They proved that the crime had been premeditated and that the family had deliberately taken the lives of 4 women. The evidence left no room for doubt. The police were now ready to make their move. Muhammad Shafia, his wife Tuba, and their son Haim were arrested on July 23, 2009. That day, they had no idea that law enforcement had already gathered enough proof to charge them. The family was preparing to fly to Dubai, but they were taken into custody just before departure. Muhammad never believed it coming. Until the last moment, he believed that the deaths of his daughters and Rona had been successfully staged as an accident, but the investigation had stayed one step ahead. When they were read their charges, first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder, they tried to remain composed, but their expressions told a different story. The trial began in January 2012 and lasted 3 months, drawing enormous public attention. Prosecutors presented undeniable evidence that the crime had been meticulously planned. The most damning evidence was the recorded conversations in the family's vehicle. In them, Muhammad proudly stated that his daughters had gotten what they deserved, while Toba and Haim fully supported this sentiment. These recordings shattered any remaining doubts about their guilt. In addition to the recordings, physical evidence was presented. Investigators demonstrated that the family's Lexus had damage consistent with a collision involving the Nissan Sentra. Experts confirmed that the Lexus had been used to push the victim's car into the water. Witnesses were called to testify. Social workers, teachers, and friends of the sisters revealed that they had spoken about the harsh treatment they faced from their father and brother. Many knew they lived in fear, but no one could have imagined it would end in such a horrific way. During the trial, Muhammad showed no remorse. He insisted that the court had misinterpreted the situation and continued to claim that his daughters had brought shame to the family. Tuba, who initially portrayed herself as a grieving mother, later changed her strategy and began denying any involvement. Haim attempted to present himself as a victim of his father's influence, but the recorded conversations completely dismantled his defense. After 15 hours of discussion, the jury found each defendant guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder. Muhammad, Toba, and Haim received life sentences in prison, with no chance of parole for 25 years. They appealed the decision, hoping for a reversal, but the court confirmed their conviction. Their actions were deemed an act of honor-based violence, a deliberate and calculated crime committed in the name of control and tradition. The family, once focused on preserving its honor, lost everything, their names became associated with cruelty. The Shafia case is now one of the most shocking examples of such crimes in Canadian history. After the arrests of Muhammad, Toba, and Hamed, the remaining Shafia children faced a challenging situation. As they were still minors, they needed guardianship. Canadian authorities intervened, placing them under state protection and assigning social services to ensure their well-being. To safeguard them from public scrutiny and potential retaliation from extended family, their identities and locations were kept confidential. Some relatives in Afghanistan tried to intervene, demanding the children be returned to their biological family, but Canadian law protected them from such demands. The younger Shafia children were given a chance to grow up away from the harmful environment of their past. They changed their names and started new lives. However, they would always carry the tragedy of their family's crimes as a lasting reminder. Their current whereabouts are unknown, but one certainty remains: they were given the opportunity for a better life, unlike their late sisters and Rona. Heloisa Maria de Alencastro Souza was born in 2008 in Cuiabá, central West Brazil. She lived peacefully with her mother, Suelen de Alencastro, and her grandmother. The family led a simple life, blending in with their community. Heloisa attended Adventist College in Centro Politico Administration, where she was a dedicated student. She was quiet in class, always completing her assignments and staying out of trouble. Heloisa didn't have many close friendships, but she did have one trusted friend with whom she shared personal thoughts. This friend later suggested that Heloisa displayed some traits of level 1 autism, although she was never officially diagnosed. Signs included her reserved nature, avoidance of eye contact, and anxiety in social situations. Despite this, Heloisa was warm and friendly with those she trusted. She had a deep passion for animals, aspired to become a veterinarian. She took her dreams seriously, researching veterinary programs from a young age. Her grandmother noted that she was responsible, helpful around the house, capable of cooking, cleaning, and caring for the family pet without needing constant supervision. She was an ordinary teenager focused on her future and goals, living a life that was steady, unassuming. Benedito Anunciaco de Santana was born in 1984 into a modest family and was the younger of 2 brothers. His older brother later became involved in a legal case related to a violent crime against his former partner. Their father was a laborer, while their mother stayed at home. The family lived in a suburb of Cuiabá. Neighbors noted that both boys were quiet from an early age and did not have a close relationship with their parents. As a teenager, Benedito began attending a local Catholic church and eventually started helping out during services. After finishing school, Benedito obtained an entry-level job at a local government agency. Through personal connections and a reputation for hard work, he gradually advanced in his career. At the time of these events, Benedito was the head of the Transportation Division at the Secretariat of Science, Technology, and Innovation in Mato Grosso. He earned a stable income, had access to a work vehicle, and was regarded as someone with a respectable social standing. In his daily life, Benedito often attended local events, expressed concerns about neighborhood problems, and suggested new initiatives. He stayed active in his church. On social media, he consistently shared religious posts, inspirational quotes, photos from events, and images of places of worship. Many of his pictures featured his son, Gustavo Benedito Jr. Lara de Santana, or were taken at churches and community celebrations. His online presence reflected the image of a stable, respectable man with strong faith. Not much is known about Benedito's personal life before he met Suelen. At the start of their relationship, he was not married and was not living with his son's mother. There are no official records of his past relationships. His behavior suggests that he deliberately kept details of his personal history private, only sharing information that supported his public persona. Suelen was employed at a government agency in Cuiabá, where she met Benedito. At first, he appeared confident, friendly. In the workplace, he was known as a dependable and dedicated employee. He was always polite, calm, and eager to assist his colleagues. This positive impression significantly influenced Suelen's choice to let him become part of her life. Their relationship reportedly started about 4 months before the incidents in question. The investigators found evidence that Benedito had full access to her home, often used her keys. This indicates that their relationship might have been more serious, long-lasting than it seemed at first. Benedito quickly became a regular part of Sue Ellen's home life. He started visiting unexpectedly, moved around the house confidently, and appeared to integrate himself into their daily routines. To outsiders, it seemed he genuinely cared and was making an effort to be involved with the family. He was calm, rarely raised his voice, and had a knack for making others feel comfortable. Benedito was older, had a stable job, projected an image of responsibility, maturity. Sue Ellen did not seem to notice anything alarming. She saw him as a source of support. Inside the house, the atmosphere was tense. Heloisa's grandmother, who lived with them, felt uneasy about Benedito's frequent visits. It wasn't that she disliked him, rather, she found his overly polite and gentle demeanor insincere. Heloisa herself felt uncomfortable during their first interactions. Although she didn't confront him or create conflict, she made a point to avoid engaging with him. She confided in a close friend, expressing that Benedito made her uneasy, even though she couldn't pinpoint exactly why. She was troubled by his gaze, his speech, and particularly the way he posed in photos. What concerned her the most were his social media posts, where he used hand gestures that reminded her of criminal symbols. She told her friend frankly that he appeared to have a shady background. Despite this, she chose not to share her concerns with her mother, possibly fearing she would be misunderstood. Heloisa's friend noted that Sue Ellen seemed either unaware of Heloisa's change in behavior or didn't consider it important. No one in the household questioned Benedito's past, his acquaintances, or his previous relationships. His behavior never raised any alarms. A seemingly decent person had gained Sue Ellen's trust without arousing suspicion. On Tuesday, April 22, 2025, at around 3 p.m., it was a typical weekday in Cuiabá. Sue Ellen and her mother were at work, leaving Heloisa home alone. She wasn't expecting any visitors, everything seemed calm. At that time, Benedito arrived at Sue Ellen's house in a government-issued Fiat Toro, which he used for his job at the Secretariat of Science and Technology. He had 3 teenagers with him, his son Gustavo and 2 others, aged 16 and 17. They had been instructed earlier and stayed hidden in the vehicle to avoid attracting attention from neighbors or security cameras. Their plan was to wait until there were no adults in the house. Benedito parked the car in the garage and entered the house alone. Surveillance footage showed that he was inside for about 15 minutes. He then returned to the car and left. The cameras did not capture anything unusual. He seemed calm. Neighbors did not report hearing any noise or seeing any signs of trouble. However, during that brief time, Benedito had let the 3 teenagers into the house. One of the confessions revealed that the group waited until Benedito left the property before executing their plan. Heloisa was inside the house alone when she saw strangers and became terrified. In her panic, she tried to escape to another room, but one of the intruders caught her. She was in shock, unable to scream or fight back. They tied her legs. Tragically, her life was taken in a room using a USB cable. At the time of the crime, Benedito was not in the house. He had reportedly left to take a work-related call. However, testimonies indicated he was aware of what was happening. Heloisa lost consciousness on the floor due to difficulty breathing. One of the attackers checked for her pulse and breathing but reported she was unresponsive. They then used ropes and bed sheets to move her body, wrapping it up, dragging it into another room to hide it temporarily. They ransacked the house to make it look like a burglary. Their next plan was to attack on Sue Ellen. By 6 p.m., Sue Ellen came home with a female relative who was holding an infant. Security cameras captured their arrival. Everything seemed normal outside, but inside, the assailants were preparing to strike. Although the lights were off, the air conditioning was running, raising Sue Ellen's suspicions. She called out for Heloisa but received no answer. As they entered the house, the 3 teenagers attacked Sue Ellen, overpowering her, hitting her, tying her up, and dragging her further inside. The woman with the infant was not harmed. She was instructed to sit quietly against the wall with the baby, not to interfere, while the attackers showed no aggression towards them. Sue Ellen was initially confused about the situation. She had been tied up, physically harmed, and locked away in one of the rooms. She thought a robbery was happening, suspected that her daughter might be tied up somewhere else in the house. The intruders did not provide any explanations, nor did they show their faces or give their names. However, at one point, Sue Ellen recognized one of the voices as belonging to Gustavo, Benedito's son. This realization made her understand that the attack was not random. While keeping Sue Ellen isolated, the intruders began to steal valuables from the house. They quickly loaded a TV, electronics, important documents, and the sheet covering Heloisa's body into Hyundai HB20. They used Sue Ellen's own car to transport the stolen items. Once they finished loading everything, the group left the house. Neither neighbors nor passers-by noticed anything out of the ordinary. Sue Ellen remained inside, still tied up and injured, unaware of the full extent of what had occurred. She believed that Heloisa had been taken away from her. No one had informed her of the truth. The crime was disguised as a robbery with an abduction. The scene was chaotic, cabinets were forced open, the lights were off, and there was a mess everywhere. It resembled a typical break-in, but it had actually been meticulously planned. The perpetrators wanted it to look like a regular home invasion. Sue Ellen had no idea that the worst had already happened. Soon after the others left, Benedito returned to the house. He didn't go in immediately. Instead, he waited outside until he was certain everything was finished. Once inside, he found Sue Ellen bound and visibly shaken. She told him that a group of young men had broken in, attacked her, stolen items, and taken Heloisa with them. Benedito's reaction was exaggerated. He pretended to be surprised, anxious. He was merely acting as if it were the first time he heard the news. Benedito was the one who suggested taking Sue Ellen to the nearest urgent care clinic. He posted on social media with a photo of Heloisa, making an emotional appeal for assistance, stating that she was missing and he needed everyone's support. His actions were carefully planned to portray him as a distressed, worried stepfather seeking help. When they arrived at the hospital, Sue Ellen was brought in a wheelchair. Surveillance footage showed Benedito assisting her into the building, talking to medical staff, and staying close to her. He appeared to want to be seen, made no effort to avoid the cameras. Authorities quickly launched an investigation after receiving a report of an assault and possible abduction. While Sue Ellen was receiving medical treatment, police took her statement, began collecting evidence. The first action was to track her vehicle, a Hyundai HB20 registered to Sue Ellen. Surveillance systems monitored the car's route, capturing it traveling along Dubai Avenue and then toward the area between Ribeiro du Lipa and the highway leading to Guarujá. In that area, investigators found a white bundle made of bed sheets and evidence indicating the vehicle had stopped there. They also discovered an old concrete well in Ribeiro du Lipa, which is where the body had been hidden. The fire department was called to safely recover the remains. Forensic experts found that the lower legs had been bound, and there were marks around the neck suggesting restricted breathing. There were no clear signs of a physical struggle. A broken leg occurred, possibly from falling down the well. At this point, investigators started to focus on individuals close to the family. While reviewing surveillance footage, they noted Benedito's unusual behavior and his attempts to portray himself as a victim. Meanwhile, investigators began gathering information about Benedito's son, Gustavo. The first arrest happened quickly. A 17-year-old involved in the crime was found hiding in an apartment in a housing complex. He surrendered immediately, did not resist. During questioning, he provided a detailed account of the events, naming all those involved, including Gustavo, the second teenager, and Benedito, who he identified as the mastermind behind the plan. The teen explained how the group operated, where they hid, how tasks were divided, who created the plan, and how the crime was executed. With this information, investigators located Gustavo at his grandmother's house. Law enforcement arrested him without incident. Gustavo confirmed the details provided by the first team, did not deny his involvement, and shared that his father had instructed him to gather people, outline the plan, actively involved him in the attack. His statement clarified that Benedito had initiated the entire scheme, that Gustavo participated in hopes of gaining his father's approval. The next arrest was of a 16-year-old who was found hiding in a messy lot in Tropicalville. He admitted to being involved in the crime but shared limited details. However, by the time he was arrested, the investigation already had a clear understanding of the situation. The recovered items matched the locations identified by various suspects, but the most important evidence came from their consistent testimonies. These statements outlined how the crime was planned, who was responsible for each part, their actions at different stages, and the order in which they occurred. Technical evidence had already linked Benedito to the central role in the crime, now it was reinforced by the direct confessions. Once all the individuals involved in the case were in custody, Benedito was brought in for questioning. Initially, he denied any involvement, claiming he was unaware of the crime, he equally shocked by what had occurred. His statements contradicted the confessions of the others. The investigators decided to set up a confrontation. The first meeting was between Benedito and a 17-year-old. When asked to speak, the teenager did not hesitate. He clearly stated that Benedito had given the instructions, taken them to the house, and left them to execute the plan. He identified Benedito as the mastermind, explained how he received specific directives. In his defense, Benedito labeled the teenager a liar, emotionally unstable. Benedito asserted that he would never allow harm to come to Eloisa and claimed he hardly knew the teenagers his son associated with. Things changed when Gustavo entered the room. He clearly stated that he had followed his father's commands. Investigators observed that this was when Benedito's story started to shift. He became vague, deflected blame, and avoided giving specifics. Later, Benedito provided a different account, saying that Sue Ellen had allegedly informed him that her daughter was exploring non-traditional personal identities and had supposedly asked him to remove any influence. He interpreted this as a prompt to take action. However, there was no evidence to support his claim. Eloisa's close friend told investigators that Eloisa had never shown romantic interest in anyone, shied away from personal topics, and had not pursued any relationships. Her family confirmed that she lived in a private world, showing no interest in intimacy or social connections. Benedito's attempt to blame Sue Ellen was viewed as a clear strategy to evade responsibility. Investigators found no evidence that Sue Ellen had any involvement in planning the crime. Benedito crafted a narrative to present himself as a victim, claiming he had misunderstood someone's words and hadn't given clear instructions. During psychological evaluations, investigators observed manipulative tendencies in his behavior. Benedito consistently influenced others while staying in the background, creating no direct links to his actions and controlling events from afar. Testimony from the teenagers made it clear that he was the key figure behind the actions, carefully avoiding direct involvement. He assigned roles, provided instructions, timed events, and maintained an external alibi. Additionally, it was revealed that in 2020, Benedito's biological brother was convicted of a violent crime against his ex-spouse. This attack occurred in broad daylight and resulted in fatal injuries. At the time, Benedito's brother was already subject to restraining orders but disregarded them. Although this was legally separate from Benedito's case, investigators noted a troubling history of aggressive behavior within the De Santana family. As the investigation progressed, Benedito's true nature came to light, revealing him as a manipulative and calculating individual. He not only got teenagers involved in a serious crime but also exploited his own son, believing Gustavo would stay silent. His behavior was cold and calculated, showing no remorse. Attempts to present an alternative story quickly fell apart. The testimonies of his accomplices, along with solid evidence, painted a clear picture against him. When confronted with undeniable facts during questioning, Benedito began to confess. He told investigators that just before the crime, he saw messages between Sue Ellen and her ex-partner, which he interpreted as a betrayal. He felt used and rejected, leading to a breaking point for him. He admitted that Eloisa annoyed him and recognized that she didn't accept him, always regarding him with suspicion. However, he denied harboring any personal hatred towards her, insisting he only wanted to restore balance in his relationship with her mother. This confession confirmed that the crime was premeditated rather than impulsive. It was not motivated by greed or fear of being caught. Instead, it stemmed from a personal desire for revenge, aiming to emotionally break someone and establish control, all while maintaining the facade of a respectable individual. The interrogation revealed that the physical aggression towards Sue Ellen was also planned, intended to incapacitate her, undermine her will, and create a false narrative of a robbery. Benedito aimed to manipulate Sue Ellen's condition and emotional shock to present himself as a concerned bystander and divert suspicion from himself. After the initial investigation, prosecutors confirmed that the case would be treated as a premeditated crime with aggravating factors. The presence of minors, the use of deceit, pre-planning, a government vehicle, and the false staging of an abduction all bolstered the prosecution's argument. Benedito Anunciaco de Santana was identified as the main suspect. He was arrested, suspended from his public position, and subsequently fired. By the time the investigation began, all suspects were in custody. The teenagers were moved to appropriate facilities, while Gustavo, who had just turned 18, was waiting for legal proceedings to take place in adult criminal court. The public's response was immediate and strong. The crime against the young girl, involving her stepfather, caused widespread outrage. Local media extensively covered the case. Central to the public's concern was the issue of trust. How could someone who seemed decent be capable of planning such a crime against his partner's daughter? Sue Ellen learned about her daughter's death while being treated by medical staff. After the assault, she had been taken to the nearest urgent care facility for help. At first, Sue Ellen thought her daughter had been kidnapped and held on to hope that she would be found alive. However, as the investigation continued and the body was discovered in a well, the police revealed the tragic truth. Sue Ellen reacted with intense grief and despair. Witnesses reported that Sue Ellen went into a state of hysteria, requiring sedation. Hospital staff recalled her screaming that she didn't feel alive, that everything was over, and that she somehow felt responsible. Later, while giving her testimony, Sue Ellen admitted she blamed herself for what happened. She realized she failed to recognize the true character of the man she had welcomed into her life. Benedito had seemed trustworthy, kind, and attentive. Only Eloisa had been wary of him from the start, but Sue Ellen dismissed her concerns as typical teenage defiance. Sue Ellen survived, but she was deeply affected by her experience, resulting in a loss that could never be reversed. The case is being investigated as murder, armed robbery, and child abuse. Eloisa's memory lived on, touching the lives of people beyond just her family. The school she attended released an official statement offering condolences and remembering her aspiration to become a veterinarian. Her relatives urged the public to be more careful about whom they invite into their homes, particularly regarding the safety of their loved ones. Although this family's story ended in tragedy, it served as a strong reminder that danger can often appear in the guise of kindness, and that the justice system's role extends beyond punishment to include prevention. Surveillance technology, law enforcement, and the analysis of digital evidence were essential in solving the case. However, the most crucial factor was our focus on the small details, those initial signs that indicated something was wrong. Kitzbühel is a small Austrian town located, with a population of just over 8,000 people. Despite its size, more than 20,000 tourists visit every winter, drawn by the local mountain slopes. For many decades, this place has been known as a winter resort for the wealthy. Additionally, there are numerous celebrations that attract athletes and fans from around the world. Since October 2018, the ski slopes have been prepared before the winter season. The hotels and tourism companies have been making the final preparations to welcome numerous guests. However, the joyful events were overshadowed by the horrific murders. Nadine Hinterholzer was born in Austria, grew up in a close-knit family. From an early age, she was energetic, cheerful, and quite pretty. She had a large circle of friends who loved her for her straightforwardness, good sense of humor, and pleasant demeanor. Nadine lived with her parents and older brother in a spacious house in Kitzbühel. At the age of 14, significant changes began in her life when she met a guy named Andreas E., who was 20 at the time. He already looked like an adult, while she was still a teenager. A 6-year age difference at that age can seem significant. Despite this, they felt a mutual attraction. After several dates, they began a romantic relationship in secret from Nadine's relatives. Eventually, they both realized that age could pose the greatest obstacle in their relationship. Nadine was concerned that her older boyfriend could face legal issues because of his involvement with a minor, but they were reluctant to break up. At first, Nadine carefully hinted to her parents about the significant changes in her life, which raised some alarms for her mother and father. However, Andreas was determined and decided to take a bold step. He personally approached Nadine's family to seek permission for their relationship. From the beginning, he emphasized that this was not a fleeting affair. He wanted to build a future with her but did not want to rush her, allowing her to finish school and pursue her education. Andreas was familiar with her brother, Kevin. Soon after meeting, they became close friends. During home visits, Andreas's initiative was highly appreciated by Nadine's parents, especially after she described him as well-mannered, polite, and loving. Overall, the family liked Andreas, so they permitted Nadine to continue their relationship. Nadine had just entered the challenging teenage years. Her parents believed that a relationship with an older boyfriend could positively influence her, as he could take care of her and protect her from unpleasant situations. Andreas acted as though Nadine meant a lot to him, growing closer to her family. Initially, they spent all their free time together, and after 3 years, Andreas moved in with them. Nadine and Andreas posted statuses on social media indicating their engagement. While Andreas had intentions of getting married, he respected Nadine's desires to finish school and make her own life decisions before rushing into marriage. They continued dating for several years, to the point where Nadine's family began to treat Andreas like their own son. Finally, Nadine turned 18, officially becoming an adult, while Andreas was already 24. They decided it was time to move out and live independently. Nadine's grandmother significantly assisted them by offering her apartment for Nadine and Andreas to settle in. By this time, Nadine had completed her schooling. She intended to continue her studies at college. She did not plan on marriage or children, which disappointed Andreas slightly, as she wanted to establish herself first. Nadine enrolled in driving school and attended classes with her friends, who often picked her up. She aspired to become a professional dancer and build a career in this field. To their relatives, Nadine and Andreas represented the epitome of romance. Although the age difference made their relationship seem unconventional, it was evident that their bond was built on love and mutual understanding. It seemed as though their lives were just beginning, with no threats on the horizon. Andreas had faced Nadine's transitional phase early in their relationship when she was just 14, and they had managed to cope with that difficult period, maintaining, even strengthening their bond. However, after she reached adulthood, some other challenges began to emerge in their relationship. Andreas was seriously determined to pursue further development, family life, and children, but he could not achieve the same aspirations from his beloved. A 24-year-old man, he worked as a bricklayer and spent the lion's share of his time, energy on his job. Upon returning home in the evening, he just wanted to relax with his girlfriend in their apartment, but this did not meet the new needs of an 18-year-old. While she had already become an adult, she still wanted to relax, spend time with friends, and go to parties. Previously, they had constantly gone out together, but now Andreas wanted to spend time at home in front of the TV, which was too boring for Nadine. Initially, she managed to persuade him to go for walks or spend time outside their home, but over time, this became nearly impossible. Andreas began to refuse such outings, citing fatigue and stating that he had to work in the morning. He complained that he wanted to relax and recharge but felt unsupported by her. During this period, the age difference between them became particularly apparent. Nadine was at the peak of her activity and craved entertainment, while she realized that Andreas had already moved past that phase of life, who now had other interests. However, she was not willing to adjust to him or give in. She wanted to live the life of a young woman, socialize, and have fun with her friends. All of this led to conflicts beginning to arise between them. Nadine even told Andreas that if this continued, she would have to break up with him. Despite her repeatedly expressing this not only to him but also to her friends and relatives, he did not take her words seriously. He saw no reason for a breakup. insisting that he still loved her, hoped she would calm down over time and everything would return to normal. He continued planning a lavish wedding, believing it was the right time since their relationship had lasted for 5 years. He wanted to change his social media status from engaged to married, but her insistence on remaining single, along with her constant reproaches and talk of breaking up, loomed over their relationship. Andreas increasingly became intrusive and rude. Nadine felt that he simply wanted to control her completely and grew angry that he could not succeed. She even began to tell her friends that they had always had problems that she had kept silent about. In the summer of 2018, Nadine made the firm decision to break up, but she did not want any conflict. She hoped they could maintain a friendly relationship. At that time, she was 19 years old, and Andreas was already 25. According to Nadine, her boyfriend was never cruel or aggressive and did not limit her communication with others. The major issue was his passivity and jealousy. He could not stand it when she was in the company of other guys. She even lost all her male friends after meeting Andreas at the age of 14. Nadine told her friend that they had decided to separate and live apart. She was sure that her boyfriend took it calmly. She believed their relationship was officially over after 5 years together. Nadine and Andreas stopped dating. He moved out of her grandmother's apartment and returned to his parents' house. The idea of maintaining friendly relations seemed to work as they both had mutual friends and kept in touch with their families. Andreas continued to be friends with Nadine's older brother, Kevin, as if nothing had happened. They were peers and had a lot in common. However, this was the calm before the storm. During this period, doubts began to surface during their communication. Nadine increasingly suspected that Andreas was not taking the breakup calmly. Kevin thought Andreas had accepted this as another whim of his girlfriend and was simply waiting for a signal from Nadine regarding the restoration of their relationship. The friends had discussed this many times. Andreas could not accept that it was truly over. Thoughts and conversations about his ex consumed almost all of his time. Andreas's behavior approached obsession. He seized every opportunity to communicate with Nadine, asking for a second chance, trying to win her back, even continuing to talk about marriage and children. Within the first month of the breakup, it became clear that Andreas did not understand the situation and was simply in denial. He did not realize that they were no longer a couple. Each time Nadine firmly said no, insisting that everything was over between them, she labeled their relationship as her youthful mistake, even confiding this to her other friends. All of this hurt Andreas, but he continued to endure. He still hoped for a reconciliation. Some of his friends sympathized with him, but by the end of the second month after the breakup, they too began to notice that his behavior resembled stalking. He showed up everywhere Nadine went, always initiating conversation. Andreas's persistence caused Nadine to start avoiding him. She tried to gently indicate that their relationship was over, but he only became more determined. When she tried to stop their meetings, he made efforts to interact with her. Nadine's friends and family knew that she was consistently rejecting his advances, but he was spreading different stories to his own circle. Even 2 months after the breakup, he still believed that she wanted to be with him and thought she was only trying to make him pursue her. Kevin tried to tell Andreas to move on and date other girls, but he remained stubborn. As of October 5, 2018, the situation remained unchanged. Nadine and Andreas had officially been separated for 3 months. Nadine's entire family was aware of the breakup. Even his parents tried to convince him to reconsider. That evening, Andreas spent time with Kevin. They visited several bars but didn't stay long in any of them. Eventually, they ended up at one bar, where Kevin unexpectedly saw Nadine. He found it surprising to run into her, especially since, despite the town being small, there were enough bars catering to tourists that it was unlikely they would see each other regularly. Andreas appeared to either be following Nadine, receiving updates on her location, or simply searching for her as he moved between various places throughout the evening. Kevin knew that for the past 3 months, Andreas had been claiming that he and Nadine loved each other and intended to get married once he won her back. While similar situations had occurred before, this time things were different. Nadine was not just with her friend, she was also accompanied by another man. When Andreas noticed this, he instantly became angry, approached Nadine, taking her hand and starting an argument. He attempted to pull her out of the bar, but she resisted. Her 24-year-old friend, Florian Jani, intervened, positioning himself between Andreas and Nadine. He insisted that he was merely a friend and not romantically involved with her, claiming they had only just met. Nonetheless, Andreas was not calmed by this explanation. He was furious that Nadine was spending time with another man and struggled to contain his anger, nearly provoking a fight in the bar. Nadine, Florian, and her brother worked hard to soothe him, prevented Andreas from asserting control over Nadine. After significant effort, they managed to calm him down, though he was still in tears. Feeling overwhelmed, Andreas chose to leave the bar, not wanting to remain in that environment. Kevin stayed behind with Nadine and Florian, worried about their safety. Andreas' outburst was alarming, and now Nadine felt genuinely concerned for her well-being. She didn't want to remain in the bar either, but feared that her ex might be waiting outside. After waiting to ensure Andreas had left, the entire group decided to walk Nadine home. Florian drove her back, even offered to stay the night to help her feel safe. Overwhelmed by fear, Nadine accepted his offer. This choice would prove to have significant consequences. Around 4 a.m., Andreas could no longer contain his jealousy and chose to contact his ex again. When he reached her house, he noticed an unfamiliar car in the driveway, which he recognized as Florian's. It became clear that Andreas hadn't gone home after leaving the bar. Instead, he had remained in the parking lot, secretly watching the group. He observed that Florian was with Nadine, while no one else had left the house. This only fueled his anger. Andreas suspected that Nadine was lying and dating someone new. He felt they were enjoying themselves together without a care. He resolved to confront both Nadine and Florian about the situation. Furious, Andreas jumped out of his car and started ringing the doorbell while banging on the front door. Instead of Nadine and her friend, her father, 59-year-old Rupert, answered. He came out to calm Andreas, who was shouting. Rupert insisted it was too late for arguments and asked Andreas to leave until morning, when they could discuss everything calmly. Rupert was aware of the situation involving Florian at the bar, reassured Andreas that Nadine and Florian were just friends. Understanding and approachable, Rupert shared a cigarette with Andreas, invited him to talk outside on the street. They had a conversation on various topics, as Rupert probably hoped this would soothe Andreas and persuade him to leave. Having known each other for several years, Andreas had become a valued member of Nadine's family. Nadine's parents treated him well, which is why Rupert chose not to call the police to remove his daughter's ex-boyfriend. After speaking with Rupert, Andreas seemed to feel less agitated. He got into his car and drove off, while Rupert returned inside to go to bed. However, just a short distance down the road, Andreas began to feel annoyed again. He came back 15 minutes later, knocking on the door and ringing the bell, which disturbed everyone in the house. Nadine and Kevin came out to confront him. Unlike Rupert, they were very upset, wanted to make it clear that Andreas needed to leave. A new argument broke out at the front door. No one was holding back their words. Nadine was determined to completely cut off ties with her bothersome ex and insisted that there should be no further relationship between them. She demanded that he vanish from her life for good. Kevin backed his sister, stating that their friendship was overdue to Andreas's stalking behavior. He was worried about Andreas's unhealthy actions and wanted nothing more to do with him. Meanwhile, Andreas felt betrayed, convinced that Nadine had been unfaithful and that Kevin was protecting her. He now felt abandoned by Kevin, who he believed should have supported him instead. Before leaving, Andreas tried to find out if Nadine had cheated. However, she firmly told him it was not his concern since they hadn't been dating for several months. At that moment, Andreas had a shocking realization. Nadine had actually broken up with him 3 months ago, and all his attempts to win her back were in vain. No one expected him to pursue her anymore. Feeling angry, Andreas decided to go home, choosing to avoid confronting his feelings of hurt. At 5:30 a.m. on October 6, 2018, Andreas returned to his ex's house. He began knocking on the door and ringing the doorbell, but he did not shout. This time, Rupert responded. He was already very irritated because Andreas had kept the whole family awake the previous night. When Rupert opened the door, he intended to angrily chase Andreas away and threatened to call the police, but he was cut off before he could finish. Andreas pulled out a gun, shot him in the head twice, killing him instantly. He then stepped over Rupert's body and entered the house. Nadine's mother, 51-year-old Andrea, rushed outside when she heard the noise. Tragically, she became the next victim. Andreas then attacked Kevin. He went upstairs and attempted to enter Nadine's room, but Nadine and Florian had locked the door. Andreas determined that the quickest way to reach her was through the balcony. He went outside, climbed the bars on the building's facade, broke the window, opened fire on both Nadine and her friend Florian. This horrific event unfolded within just a few minutes, resulting in the deaths of 5 people. After committing the crime, Andreas drove to the Kitzbühel police station. He arrived around 6 a.m. and placed a gun in front of a police officer at the entrance. He confessed to having just shot 5 people. Additionally, he handed over a knife and a baseball bat, which he had used to break into the Hinterholzer home. He used the bat to shatter a window and gain access to Nadine's room. While the knife was never used, it appears he brought it along for safety. The police discovered 5 bodies at the scene, and the details of their deaths confirmed Andreas's account. Each victim had been attacked at close range with multiple bullets. Florian suffered gunshot wounds to his hands as he tried to defend himself. There was nothing missing from the house. The toxicology report indicated that Andreas was sober, with no alcohol or banned substance in his system. He had no prior legal issues. The entire community of Kitzbühel was in shock over the incident. In this close-knit town, crimes, especially such violent ones, were extremely rare. All the neighbors were familiar with the Nadine family, known for their kindness and helpfulness. They had good relationships with everyone in the area. Both the victim's family and the suspect's family were respected in the community. The community especially mourned the loss of Florian Jani, a talented young hockey player and goalkeeper, who was seen as a promising individual. His compassion for Nadine ultimately led to his tragic death. Friends who knew Nadine well later stated that she had no romantic involvement with Florian. They were simply friends who enjoyed good conversations. However, some speculated that Florian stayed the night to protect her, and suggested that they might have already begun dating. Following the tragedy, a small memorial with photographs of the victims was set up in the local church. Over the course of the month it remained there. More than 1,000 heartfelt notes were left by mourners and caring individuals in memory of the victims. Andreas had been in custody in a special cell designed for inmates needing extra supervision. The police considered him at high risk for end one's own life, so they monitored him closely. He spent 23 hours a day in solitary confinement and was allowed only 1 hour outside to walk in the yard. When the family of Andreas learned what had happened, they addressed the town's residents, expressed their condolences. They also informed the police that a gun belonging to Andreas's brother was missing. The brother had a permit for the firearm, which he kept at home for self-defense. Unfortunately, Andreas knew how to access it and where the key to the safe was. The gun's serial numbers matched, and Andreas confirmed that he had stolen the gun from the house. At a press conference, Andreas's parents expressed their belief that he should face appropriate consequences for his actions. They mentioned that their son's mental health had declined while he was in prison. Despite widespread public anger, the family attempted to explain Andreas's behavior. His father stated that Andreas had been struggling with depression, particularly following his breakup with Nadine. His mother added that while her son might have had mental health challenges, it is unclear why he and his family never pursued mental health treatment. Andreas faces charges for murdering 5 people with a firearm and for breaking and entering. Andreas's lawyer intends to base their defense on his client's questionable mental state. Andreas claims that after hearing hurtful remarks from Nadine and her brother, who attempted to force him out of the house, he lost touch with reality and was unable to control his actions. He states that the only thought in his mind was his desire to kill the cheater. He described this experience as a state of emotional turmoil. The lawyer hoped this would reduce his client's culpability. However, the prosecution argued that Andreas was merely pretending and insisted that he was aware of his actions, he fit to stand trial. The lawyer disagreed with this assessment. In the end, the court ruled that there were no grounds for reducing Andreas's criminal responsibility. Andreas believed he deserved a fair punishment and did not want to evade responsibility for his crime. From the outset, he intended to confess. He willingly went to the police station and had no plans to take back his confession made the morning after the massacre. His lawyers stressed Andreas's mental state during the case. Assessments revealed that he suffered from a disorder that left him with two choices: either walk away and forget or return to kill. There was no middle ground. Once he understood that he could not regain his relationship with Nadine, he became obsessed with the notion that Nadine should not belong to anyone. As soon as the murder trial started, Andreas confessed to the crime. He believed that confessing would make the legal process easier and reduce trauma for the victims' families, as well as for himself. He shared details about his relationship with Nadine, discussing his jealousy and the reasons behind his actions. He described Nadine as an attractive girl who attracted many admirers, which fueled his jealousy. Andreas held traditional views about women and felt that a good woman should behave differently. He couldn't accept Nadine's decision to break up, insisting that she was his property and that she shouldn't date or spend time with other men, even as just friends. On the night of the incident, he was also affected by Kevin's betrayal. Nadine's parents were annoyed with Andreas, and he was afraid of losing her entire family, with whom he felt closer than to his own. He claimed that after the breakup, his family did not provide the support he desperately needed, leading him to lose 10 kilograms. Ultimately, in a moment of rage, Andreas lost control and killed them all. Andreas showed remorse and offered condolences to the families of his victims, but some believed he was merely trying to get a lighter sentence. Prosecution witnesses testified that Nadine continuously told Andreas that their relationship was over. Despite this, he kept asking for another chance, hoping to get back together, and he stalked her without truly grasping the situation. During the hearing, Andreas came across as insecure. He spoke softly, often mumbling to himself, and cried during emotional moments. At times, he seemed to misunderstand the gravity of what happened, viewing it as an accident. The prosecution contended that there was clear evidence of a brutal, premeditated murder involving 5 victims. They argued that Andreas had ample time to think through his actions as he drove to and from his ex-girlfriend's house. When he returned home, he took 3 items: a gun, a knife, and a baseball bat, indicating that he had meticulously planned his actions. The choice to take a knife suggested he intended to ensure there would be no survivors among Nadine's family and her friend Florian. During the hearing, the prosecution pointed out that Andreas had changed his marital status on social media from engaged to widower. Andreas claimed that this change occurred shortly after Nadine's murder, but some friends and acquaintances suggested that Andreas may have done so intentionally beforehand. Just a few months after their breakup, he started reacting more aggressively to Nadine's rejections. He often expressed a desire for her to be dead and sent messages accusing her of dating someone new, voicing a wish to kill that person. At the time, these statements were not taken seriously. The lawyer argued that these were simply emotional responses to rejection, which Andreas struggled to accept. However, this did not necessarily mean he intended to kill her. Nadine's friends mentioned that she had been feeling fearful of her ex lately and had been trying to avoid him as much as she could. She discovered that Andreas had been engaging in violent acts, such as beheading chickens with a machete and torturing cats. His actions appeared to be quite dangerous. During the trial, the defendant struggled to answer many questions, especially regarding why, in addition to Nadine, her friend Florian, brother Kevin, and her parents were killed. The lawyer argued that this showed Andreas lacked control over his actions and didn't fully grasp what was happening. However, the Austrian justice system made a definitive ruling: the murder of 5 people could not be seen as a mitigating factor. The idea that Andreas was insane was dismissed. By the end of the trial, he was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. Nevertheless, this doesn't mean he will be incarcerated for life. In Austria, individuals with life sentences are often released after an average of 21 years. Furthermore, the lawyer vowed to continue advocating for his client's release and planned to file appeals. Kapunda, South Australia, was a quiet town where residents felt secure. Inside the Rowe family home, it appeared calm, the lights were off, the house was silent, and the family was asleep. However, just after midnight, a violent struggle ensued. An intruder had entered the house, and in moments, the Rowe family's home became a scene of terror. The next morning, everything appeared normal from the outside. The house seemed unchanged, and nobody was aware of the events that had transpired just a few hours earlier. It would take several days for neighbors to become concerned and to recognize that something was seriously wrong. What happened that night? In 2010, the small town of Kapunda in South Australia was a place where everyone knew each other, life was calm and relaxed. One notable family in the community was the Rowes, who lived a simple but fulfilling life. The father, Andrew Rowe, had moved from England to Australia with his family when he was 3 years old. They settled in Adelaide. As a child growing up in the suburbs, Andrew was friendly and had a passion for fishing trips with his dad. His laid-back personality made him approachable and likable to those around him. As a young man, Andrew met Rose, a lively and cheerful woman who was just a year younger than him. They connected immediately and soon became inseparable. In 1985, they married in a small ceremony with close friends and family. Their happiness grew with the birth of their son, Christopher, in 1987, and later their daughter, Chantel, in 1994. They then started a carpet cleaning business that quickly thrived, giving them financial security. By 2010, Christopher had moved out and was living with his girlfriend nearby, while 16-year-old Chantel was managing both school and a part-time job at a local cafe. That year, Chantel encountered an unexpected challenge. She found out she was pregnant. Despite the obstacles ahead, she was determined to create a future for her child, with her boyfriend, Dylan, providing steadfast support. Life in the Rowe household continued normally until the night of November 8, 2010. Events that unfolded that night would deeply shock the town and lead investigators to search for answers in one of the most brutal crimes the region had ever experienced. After midnight, an intruder broke into the Rowe home and committed a violent massacre. The crime scene was horrifying, with blood covering the floors, walls, and ceiling. Surprisingly, it took 2 days for anyone to notice that something was wrong. Concerned neighbors, disturbed by the unusual silence and lack of activity from the Rowe home, decided to investigate. Looking through the windows, they were met with a shocking sight. Andrew and Rose were found dead in the kitchen, their bodies severely mutilated. Chantel was discovered in her bedroom, and the brutality of her murder was even more unsettling. Each family member had suffered numerous stab wounds, becoming victims of a brutal and merciless attack. The autopsy provided horrifying details. Andrew had been stabbed 29 times, Rose over 50 times, and Chantel 33 times. Disturbingly, Chantel had also been assaulted prior to her murder, making the tragedy even more incomprehensible. While vacationing in Queensland with his fiancée, Christopher first learned about a crime in his hometown through social media. Investigators first focused on Christopher, the lone survivor of the Rowe family, but soon cleared him as a suspect. The investigation took a chilling turn when authorities uncovered disturbing details. After the murders, the killer did not flee in a hurry, rather, they took their time. Evidence indicated that the perpetrator changed into clean clothes and even rested on Chantel's bed. Drag marks revealed that she tried to hide but was pulled from her hiding spot. Robbery was ruled out as a motive since nothing was stolen. Valuables like electronics and cash were untouched. The brutality of the crime suggested either a personal vendetta or the actions of someone with a disturbingly cruel nature. Furthermore, parts of the crime scene seemed to have been wiped clean, suggesting an unsuccessful attempt to eliminate evidence. Bloody footprints led to the front door of the Rowe home but suddenly stopped outside, indicating that the killer deliberately removed their shoes and exited in socks to avoid leaving more evidence. The most shocking discovery was the absence of forced entry. This indicated that the murderer was likely someone the family knew and trusted or had found a discreet way to enter. As investigators looked into the gruesome crime scene, they found that Rose had suffered the most. She had been stabbed over 50 times, much more than the others. She initially survived the attack and managed to make a phone call for help before the killer realized she was still alive. Unfortunately, before she could escape, the murderer came back and continued stabbing her until she was silenced for good. As investigators faced this harsh reality, they began to identify possible suspects. Andrew and Rose had no enemies, financial issues, or ongoing disputes that could explain such a violent crime. This left them considering one probable motive: Chantel. At only 16, Chantel was juggling school, a part-time job, and preparing for her baby's unexpected arrival. Her boyfriend, Dylan, had been supportive throughout her challenges. They had been together for a year, shared the same school, and made plans for their future. Although Dylan, also 16, seemed like an unlikely suspect, the police needed to be thorough in their investigation. They questioned him, verified his alibi, and searched for any reason someone might want to harm Chantel or her family. Dylan cooperated fully from the beginning. Heartbroken, he candidly expressed his love for Chantel, their hopes of raising their child together, and how the news of her murder had devastated him. He had a strong alibi, as he was celebrating his grandfather's anniversary in another city, with numerous witnesses to confirm his presence. With Dylan eliminated as a suspect, the investigation faced another frustrating standstill. However, the police had a significant asset: the killer's DNA. Forensic teams had gathered samples, including seminal fluid, which could lead directly to the murderer. Yet, when they checked it against the national database, they found no match, indicating that the perpetrator had no previous criminal history. Another important detail came to light: the murder weapon was one of the knives from the Rose kitchen. This indicated that the attack might not have been planned in advance, but rather a spontaneous act of violence. Additionally, the killer had taken the knives with him, removing a key piece of evidence. The estimated time of death was between midnight and 2 a.m. A neighbor later revealed they heard Rose scream for help around 1 a.m., followed by a loud thud, but assumed it was just a heated argument and did not call the police. With few clues and no obvious suspects, investigators reached out to the public for help, hoping to make progress. They received numerous tips, but most were misleading, consisting of wild theories, hoaxes, or leads that went nowhere. Just when it seemed like the investigation had stalled, Dylan remembered something important. The night before Chantel's murder, she had been unwell. She had a fever and had called her boss to inform them that she wouldn't be coming to work the next day. At precisely 5 a.m., Dylan texted her to check on how she was feeling. His message was read, but there was no response. Unbeknownst to him at the time, Chantel had already been dead for several hours, and it was someone else in the house who had read his message. The most frightening discovery followed. The killer had attempted to reply to Dylan's message, but since Chantel's phone had no credit, the message did not go through. This was a failed effort to make it look like she was still alive. With this unsettling clue, detectives began to investigate Chantel's social circle, looking for anyone who might hold a grudge. They soon encountered Jason Alexander Downey. Jason was part of the same school group as Dylan but hardly knew Chantel. He appeared innocent, of average height, thin, and quiet. Detectives started with the intention of asking Jason a few standard questions and moving on. However, as the interview progressed, his behavior became concerning. Instead of responding straightforwardly, he appeared nervous and avoided direct answers. Unexpectedly, he also claimed to have an alibi for the night of the murders, even though no one had inquired about it. The contradictions in his statements were quite troubling. Investigators collected fingerprints and DNA samples from Jason for comparison. He complied readily, showing an unusual calmness that momentarily led them to question their suspicions. However, they soon noticed several recent cuts on his palms. When asked about them, Jason attributed the injuries to an accident at a machine shop, but the wounds appeared too clean and precise, resembling injuries from gripping a knife. Forensic experts quickly found the answer. Jason's fingerprints matched those found on Chantel's bedroom door exactly. The belief that the murderer needed to be big and strong was incorrect. Jason, who was thin and seemed harmless, had overpowered 3 individuals in a sudden outburst of rage. Even more alarmingly, He deceived almost everyone around him. He even went to Chantel's memorial, laid down flowers, and pretended to mourn with her family and friends. Originally from Scotland, Jason had relocated to Kapunda with his mother and older brother. While his life appeared normal on the outside, there was a much darker side hidden beneath the surface. Chantel and Jason were never really close. She was polite to him, didn't dislike him, but she also didn't have any strong feelings for him. To her, he was just another member of the group. In contrast, Jason's feelings toward her were more intense. He had previously tried to show interest in Chantel, but she had rejected him. When he learned that Chantel was pregnant with Dylan's child, it triggered his jealousy. Jason's obsession had become overwhelming, and on the night of November 8th, his emotions hit a peak. When police first questioned Jason after his arrest, his unnerving calmness surprised the detectives. He denied any involvement, speaking with a disturbing confidence as if he could dismiss the growing evidence against him. He claimed that his fingerprints at the row home were from a visit several weeks prior, but that was not the only untruth. Forensic analysis showed that Jason's DNA was found on Chantel's body. When confronted with this evidence, he told an implausible story, insisting that he and Chantel had been intimate during his last visit. However, the science was clear: DNA cannot stay viable on a body for weeks, it had to be recent. During the interrogation, Jason eventually broke down and shared a troubling account of the events from that night. Earlier, he had a fierce argument with his mother and stepfather, which left him feeling frustrated and angry. As a result, he decided to sleep in his car. However, after learning from Dylan that Chantel was homesick and vulnerable, his feelings for her took a disturbing turn. What began as a simple plan to drive past her house turned into something much more alarming. He parked his car at the end of the street, out of sight, and approached her home. The house was dark and quiet, except for one bathroom window that was ajar. Being thin and agile, Jason managed to slip through the small opening easily. Once inside, he waited in the bathroom for nearly half an hour, listening to ensure that the house was completely silent. He later claimed his only purpose was to confess his feelings to Chantel, but this raises questions. If that were true, why did he bring a kitchen knife with him before entering her bedroom? The investigators quickly recognized that Jason was not being honest. He hadn't come to share his feelings, he wanted to manipulate Chantel. As soon as he entered her room, she sensed something was wrong. When she pushed back against him, it triggered his anger. In a blind rage, Jason grabbed a knife and attacked her, stabbing her multiple times. The noise alerted her parents, who rushed to help, but Jason, now completely engulfed in violence, turned the knife on them as well, brutally killing both. Later, Jason attempted to argue that his actions were a crime of passion, but the evidence pointed to something much more sinister: premeditation. As the police investigated further, they uncovered more incriminating evidence. They found a pair of bloodstained shoes left in a remote location. The DNA on them matched all three victims. The shoe prints also matched the bloody footprints at the crime scene. Additionally, Jason's sweat was discovered inside the shoes, adding to the evidence against him. Although he occasionally cooperated, offering to lead detectives to where he supposedly discarded the murder weapons, those weapons were never found. The police believed he was trying to manipulate the investigation and buy time, even as more evidence piled up against him. By the fall of 2011, almost a year after the murders, Jason Alexander Downey was on trial. Throughout the trial, he remained strangely emotionless, frequently changing his statements but never expressing genuine remorse. He claimed to have no memory of killing the Rowe family, even though there was strong forensic evidence proving his guilt. A particularly disturbing detail came to light during the trial. After the murders, Jason took Chantel's pendant and chain as a twisted trophy, serving as a grim reminder of the girl who had rejected him. Jason's intense feelings of rejection drove him to commit horrific acts. When he eventually pleaded guilty, it wasn't because he felt sorry, rather, it was a strategic choice to receive a lighter sentence. One investigator remarked, his guilty plea should not be interpreted as remorse. These murders were brutal, premeditated, and shocking beyond comprehension. On April 17, 2012, Jason Alexander Downey was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 35 years. If he had not pleaded guilty, he would have had to serve at least 45 years before being eligible for parole. In a last attempt to manipulate the situation, Jason wrote a letter to Chantel's family and friends. In the letter, he expressed regret and claimed he deserved his punishment. However, the sincerity of his apology felt superficial and insincere, similar to a child being forced to say sorry instead of a man who genuinely regrets his actions. For Christopher Rowe, who lost his entire family in a single night, no sentence could ever replace what he has lost. To honor his loved ones, he decided to tattoo their names on his body, a lasting tribute to his parents and sister, who he will never see again. After the tragic event, Christopher stepped away from work to heal from painful memories. When he came back, he struggled to adjust to his previous life. Eventually, he took over his father's business.